of the Public Utilities Commission is here. So in that case, I will be running the meeting. Should there be, I'm Peter Gorey, I'm chairman of the Finance Commission. As we go forward, excuse me, should there be a need for any vote, then we will separately, as we have to, separately vote as a Finance Commission and as a Utility Commission. So I will call the roll will be called for if there's a need for from the each of the separate committees by the by sheriff. I just want to make one point before we start, and that is there's 22,000 customers of water sewer in the city of Vero Beach's territory. Of the 22,000, 8,800 are in the county and an unincorporated county and in River Shores. Those customers will not be included in what we are hearing today. What we're hearing today on the stormwater management in Vero Beach and the presentation is going to apply only for those customers who are in the city of Vero Beach. Just wanted to make that clear for the public and for obviously those of us on the count know that. With that, I understand, Monty, you would like to make an introduction?
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Gorey. I'm Monty Falls, Director of Public Works, and before we get started, just to acknowledge Jim O'Connor, City Manager here, and Cindy Lawson, our Finance Director, is here as well. I've been with the city for 25 years, and with me today from our Public Works staff, Don Dexter, our Public Works Manager, been with the city 36 years. Matt Mitz, our new Assistant City Engineer, has been with the city for 8 years. And Danessa Pecorino, who's been with the city for an hour and a half. Danessa started this morning, so welcome, Danessa. And I'd also like to acknowledge a former employee who retired about a month ago, Bill Messersmith, who came down today, sitting in the back of the room. But Bill worked with us for 22 years, and he was instrumental in bringing our stormwater program, to where it is today. So Matt and I are going to give you a brief introduction of the stormwater management system in the city of Vero Beach, and then Amelia Fontaine with Collective Water Resources, they're going to present their stormwater utility study to you guys. Our goal for today will be to get your recommendation on a couple things. First and foremost is to whether you want to proceed with looking into a stormwater utility. And if you do, there's two decision points we need, is to look at how we do our rate structure and our billing method. And those will all be spelled out for you in Amelia's presentation. So with that, Matt's going to lead us off here.
Excuse me, I think that this is a rather unique and complex, Monty. I don't know whether we will have sufficient time to contemplate whether making a specific recommendation on the rates and the structure. Obviously, we will hear it out, but we did have a preview that was provided to us, and I read it through, and I'm just
not so much the rates, but the methodology for the rates. We're looking for the rate methodology and billing methodology.
Thank you. I guess I wasn't listening closely. Thanks a lot.
Good morning, everyone. Matt Mitz, Assistant City Engineer, Public Works. And before we talk about a stormwater utility, I think it's important to talk about stormwater and what the city does related to it. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some stormwater basics, starting off with a watershed. And this concept is called the water cycle. And basically the idea here is that when it rains, that water hits the ground and turns into stormwater runoff. And that runoff is a source of pollution because everything that the water encounters on its way to the river is a source of pollution. It's fertilizer, grass clippings, trash you see. All of it is potentially a source of pollution. And what we'll look at here is, here's the city today. You can see the corporate limits in red. And as you mentioned at the beginning of the meeting, this would only apply to people inside of our municipal limits. And this is a digital elevation model. So what we're showing here is basically water flows downhill. And there's a couple key features to look at. One is that from west to east, you go from high to low. There's a couple landmarks worth mentioning. One is the FEC Railway. This is a historic ridge that used to be, you can think of it sort of as a berm or a speed bump on the way down to the river. Water used to pool behind us and slowly overpour it. And in the early 1900s, the Indian River Farms Water Control District cut a hole through this, basically, where the main canal is now. It was a historic creek that went through it, but it was improved over time. So historically, this water went downhill through wetlands and marshes and finally into the river, and now this system is piped and conveyed directly with man-made improvements. And to demonstrate this, talk a little bit about an area of town that most people are familiar with, and it's typical of not only the city but other cities along the river as well. And this is the earliest aerial we have on record. This is done in 43 to 45, but you can see here, point out here with the mouse, this is what will be Vero Isles. You see a little lake. This was all a marsh. You can see Royal Palm Boulevard in place, already existing, and some agricultural uses here. And what we're going to see over time is a change in how this system works. So starting in the early 50s, we start to see some improvements to the old Barber Bridge. Moving forward, in 57, we can see that Vero Isles has been cut and formed. There are now 8-foot deep canals in between here, and this has been drained so that it's suitable for real estate and commercial uses, and also the agriculture uses that are being made. And it's important for these people to live here, for all of us to live here, we have to get water off the property. We don't want our properties to flood, so that's flood protection. So right now, all anyone is concerned about is moving water, so keep that in mind. Moving forward in time, you can see basically the skeleton of our system is in place by this point. Underground pipes, conveyances, you can start to see the Miracle Mile Plaza start to take shape. And from here on out, you're going to start seeing things just being filled in, but the basic infrastructure or the concept of it is already in place. Moving forward a little bit, things start filling in. So by the 70s, most of everything that's there today, except for Indian River Boulevard going through, is already in place. And things just start filling in over time. And this is 1991. Keep this date in mind. You can see things have mostly started to fill in here. And I want to turn it back over to Monty to talk about our modern infrastructure.
This map that's up there now shows our system of pipes and ditches. The pipes are shown in blue and the ditches are in orange. Our core infrastructure, we have 77 miles of pipe that are in the ground and 43 miles of ditches, and somewhere around 6,000 drainage structures. Those would be inlets or manholes or what have you. The value of that infrastructure that we estimate is in the neighborhood of $25 million. And like Matt said, the bulk of that infrastructure was installed prior to the 90s. So much of it is approaching 50 years old, which is considered the design life of a lot of this type of infrastructure. So if you were to get on a 50-year replacement cycle for this, it would take about $500,000 a year in R&R for that system.
And that's summarized here, basic concept. And an important thing to keep in mind, this is just to move stormwater, flood protection. There's no treatment in place. And that concept I've kind of highlighted here on a timeline. So starting in the early 1900s, the Farms Water Control District was created to provide irrigation for agriculture, land use for real estate, commercial, agriculture. The city was founded, and for a long time, there was no change in that mission. And then in the mid-70s, the Clean Water Act was passed, and the famous language from that is swimmable and fishable. That was the narrative goal of the Clean Water Act. And also at this time, the state water management districts, such as St. John's Water Management District, which we're under, those districts were created as well. And moving into the 80s, there was some state laws passed, and in 1988, the city updated its stormwater ordinance to actually the one that was in place when I started here 8 years ago, that began to require private developments to build stormwater ponds or infrastructure improvements to sites that were being developed after 1988. But keep in mind that a lot of the city is already developed at this point, and this is only for private developments, or if, say, the city built a building such as our Air West facility was built after this point, we had to get an ERP permit, we had to build it to our standards. So those new things are built to a higher standard, but a lot of it at this point hasn't. And moving forward in time, you can see that our mission has changed from not just moving stormwater, but to treating it as well. And that mission is relatively new in our municipal cycle. And there's been a lot of things happening recently at the state level. And just to highlight a couple things here, the TMDL, which is the total maximum daily loads. So in 2009, the state officially declared the lagoon to be impaired for nutrients. And the city updated our code again in 2010. We started requiring some improvements for single-family developments to help out as well, and just updating our code in general. And then a couple other things happened in 2011 and 12. We had a super bloom event that devastated seagrasses, and I'll show that to you here on the next slide. And we entered the first phase of our BMAP, which is the state's legislative document saying, what is everyone doing to clean up the river? That started in 2013, and for the city at that point, there was no mandated reductions. Basically, the state said that the city doesn't have to improve things, but we already were. So at that point, it was by choice. But we expect, because of the destruction of the seagrasses, you'll see here, that starting in 2018, that mandates are going to come down, and municipalities such as the city of Vero Beach and our neighbors here in Indian River County will have to do some sort of improvements. And during the first cycle, Brevard County, our neighbors up north, they've already had these mandated reductions because of some different conditions up there. But lagoon-wide in 2011 and 12, there was just a devastating effect on seagrasses, and that's why we're seeing a change at the state level of legislated mandates.
Excuse me, may I ask, why does this go only to 2012? And what is it currently?
The seagrass surveys are done every 2 years. They did one in 2011 because of the super bloom, but the one that's being done for 2015 is the most recent year. It is not out yet. It's due out in sometime in March or April.
Do you know what it looks like?
No. I don't expect it to be, hopefully there's a trend of recovery, but from what I've heard unofficially, I can't comment on that until I see official results from, this is issued from St. John's River Water Management District. And the historic goal is, if you look back in 1943, those are our earliest aerials we showed earlier, that's the benchmark we're trying to reach, saying if we can get seagrasses back to that state, that'd be our goal. And we're not there. And you see that there was a trend of recovery, but something happened. And that's what everyone's trying to figure out right now, and it is requiring us to start making changes. And I'm going to hand it back over to Monty to talk about one of our key projects.
We picked this project to highlight the difference between a water quantity, or just moving stormwater to a water quality, or treating stormwater project. I know most of you are familiar with the Humiston Park area, and you've seen the pipe that discharges out to the ocean. Well, prior to 2010, all the water that drained off of Ocean Drive was collected down at Easter Lily Lane near Mrs. Corey's pharmacy there, and was pumped directly to the ocean. In the decade from 2001 to 2009, we had 21 recorded beach closures due to E. coli bacteria in the water. So we were undertaking the Humiston Park Improvement Project in 2010, and had a grant to do some work actually on the lateral E canal near the Vero Man site. And because of the Vero Man site, we had to delay that work. But the EPA and DEP let us transfer the grant to another water quality project. So what we did at Humiston, you can see in the picture there below the chart, the big construction project underway, we constructed an exfiltration system up on top of the dune there in the grassy area of the park, just to the east of the new playground. Now when that water is collected at the Ocean Drive in Easterly, instead of being pumped directly to the ocean, it's pumped into this exfiltration system. That exfiltration system allows the water to percolate back into the groundwater. With the installation of this, we have reduced the discharge to the ocean by 90%. Only when there is a very, very large storm event that the system can't handle all the runoff from the road is any water discharged to the ocean. Since this was installed in 2010, there has not been one beach closure due to water quality. So this was a success project for a water quality project. It was about a $600,000 project, and almost 60% of it was from grant funding. Matt, you want to go to that next couple slides there? That just shows the location of the trench there, and the red arrow is how it used to be discharged before. Where are we today? Currently, 34% of our urban watershed has some form of treatment. We started putting treatment measures in about 10 years ago. The technology's improved. We've gotten more reduction in nitrogen and phosphorus because of the new technologies. Over the next 5 years, if we would commit $500,000 a year to treatment projects, we could have 53% of the city's watershed treated. And with the expense of another $1 million over the next couple years, we could get up to 2/3 of the area. And that would give us the area that was really ripe for treatment. The others are spread out, very small watersheds, small pipes, and the bang for the buck is not very much in those areas. Hopefully by that time there'll be some other technologies that may make it easier to treat those smaller areas.
May I ask, is the step system reflected in any of these numbers?
The step system is not a stormwater system. It will help us, we think, when the final BMAPs are adopted. It will give us some credits for leachate from septic tanks that could get into the groundwater and find their way to the lagoon. But we hope that to be included when the BMAPs are adopted in 2018.
Thank you.
Historically, over the last 5 years, we've spent about $320,000 on R&R and about $190,000 on treatment. So we spent about $500,000 to get to the point where we've talked about in our R&R with needing $500,000 a year to get on a 50-year replacement cycle, and $500,000 a year for the treatment to get up to the 66% level. We need about $1 million a year in stormwater infrastructure spending. Currently,
excuse me, Mone.
Yes, sir.
When you're complete, I wanted to go into what our 5-year capital program is and how it's funded now, but I'll put that off until we hear the presentation.
This slide here shows our current spending level. That's the 325 and the 190 that I talked about. Currently, those are the repair and restoration is not eligible for grant funding, and that's paid for with sales tax revenue dollars. The treatment is paid for with sales tax revenue dollars and grants. And then the final column there, manpower and equipment, just the routine operating expenses are paid for with ad valorem taxes through the general fund. If we look at the $500,000 a year proposed spending in each of those categories with the manpower and equipment remaining the same, the possible funding sources for the R&R would again be sales tax revenue. It could be additional general tax revenue or revenue from a stormwater utility. The TMDL, the water quality improvements, again, sales tax revenue. It could be general fund revenue, grant revenue, or revenue from a stormwater utility. And the manpower and equipment, the general expenses would continue to come from the ad valorem taxes through the general fund. that's going to wrap up our presentation. I'm going to turn it over, unless you have questions of me, to Amelia Fontaine and her group from Collective Water, and they'll give you the information that we're here to consider today. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, as Matt gets me set up. I'm Amelia Fontaine, as Monty said. We've been contracted by the city for the stormwater utility study. We've completed the preliminary analysis and evaluation of options for the rate structure and billing method. We've estimated the projected total billable ERUs and projected revenue, looking at all the parcels within the city and making some simplifications for the purposes of estimation. And so with me here today I have Camille Tharp with GSG and Brett Cunningham with Jones Edmonds. They were also on the team. Camille has met with the city and looked at some of the aspects of the billing database and other aspects that will be needed to set up the utility. Brett and Jones Edmonds have conducted a lot of the necessary hydrologic calculations and other engineering aspects of the analysis. They also will be part of the ordinance adoption in the future parts of the project. And then looking, also PRMG is a rate consulting company that you may be familiar with from the other cities' utilities, and Henry Thomas is also on the team for this project. So I will get into some of the general considerations in developing a stormwater utility, some background.
May I ask a question first? Who is the author of what we read, of the study? Because
I am the author. Information was provided from each of the sub-consulting firms as well.
But you were directing it then?
Yes, I'm the project manager. I'm sorry. Yes, okay. I'm the project manager for the project.
Okay, but all four firms contributed information?
Yes. Yes, that's true. And there are appendices within that document. There's some additional information with respect to the different billing methodologies that was provided by Camille's group, and then some information with respect to the hydrologic analysis and the rate structure alternatives, and that appendix was largely provided by Jones Edmonds.
Okay.
So I worked with everyone to get all the information together and pull it into the main report.
Okay, thank you.
Yes. So I'm going to get into some of the background for structuring the utility, considerations for the billing system design and the rate structure design. And then I'll talk a little bit about how we analyzed rate structures for the city. And then Camille will speak for a minute about options for the billing method. And we have some results within this as well. I believe that you all have a copy of the stormwater report. So there is more detail in there as well, but we will also be available to answer questions once I go through this presentation. So the general considerations, you want the rate structure to be fair and simple. You want to balance that so that it's easier to administrate, and you're going to minimize ongoing administrative updates. It also needs to be legally defensible. And the user fee needs to be proportional to the burden that the user places on the stormwater system. And equivalent ERUs are the measure that's used to define that burden. Plus, you need to consider credits and exemptions. So how is burden assessed through the stormwater ERU? It is based on the rate and volume of stormwater runoff from the parcel, from the private property. Pollutants in stormwater runoff from the property are also an aspect of the ERU. So looking at how is the ERU defined, when you look at a parcel, this is an example of a single family residential parcel looking down on it. The gross parcel area includes impervious area, which is the roof, patio, driveway, sidewalk, as well as pervious areas, which is grass and pretty much all the landscaping and everything. For this study, we looked at 4 rate structures, 2 of which included impervious area only. So imperviousness throughout the parcels in the city was the basis for 2 of the rate structures. And then the other 2 alternatives looked at gross parcel area, which included the pervious areas. And so we pulled the parcel database from the property appraiser, looked at parcel statistics with respect to imperviousness on each of the parcels within the city limits. And the parcel statistics indicate that the median is the appropriate standard to define the runoff potential from properties within the city. I'm going to focus on the impervious area approach that we took, those 2 rate structures. The pervious area approach is somewhat similar. The defining difference is probably just that we defined runoff from the pervious areas as well, and the statistical approach is somewhat similar with respect to the parcel statistics.
My understanding that with regard to runoff, and this comes from the Brevard County study that Judy provided, that there's runoff on the surface, and then there is what is called base flow, also referred to as shallow infiltration, and that's water, I guess it's been absorbed by the soil, but will also have an impact. Did you account for both of those?
Yes, we did look at the water table elevation throughout the city when we looked at the pervious area. I'll get to this more because there is complexity in including that information from an administrative approach as well as a fairness approach because of the variability throughout the city of how far down the water table is. If you go, as Matt showed the terrain throughout the city. So, for instance, over in the golf course area by the country club, the water table is rather close to the surface, whereas like in downtown, the soils are relatively well drained. So there's some reasons that I'll get into that though a little bit more.
All right,
we can maybe go further with it in the Q&A.
Can I have a question, clarification?
Sure.
You're listing just single-family residential parcels. Is there no distinction between single-family and commercial use of property so far?
I'll get into this as well. That's actually on one of the next slides as well. So that's coming.
Excuse me. Before we move off of that, when I noted that we only looked at about 20 houses out of 5,000, were those 20 really representative of the whole marketplace? That seems like a pretty small number to look at versus the magnitude of the issue.
We can get to that too. You can get more, you can get more accurate results if you look at more parcels. That is something we've talked about with the city, with sampling a larger number of parcels or defining a larger number.
Like a pretty small sample.
We can talk more about that in the Q&A part. So the single-family residential parcels, as I said, median impervious area, the 3,357 square feet. You can see that's a good measure for 1 ERU, which is the standard for runoff from all the properties. So applying the ERUs across the other single-family residences that are larger or smaller than 1 ERU. So 1 ERU is applied to properties that are above the first quartile of the frequency distribution and below the 75th percentile. And then so properties smaller than that are assigned 0.66 ERUs, and properties larger than that are assigned 1.42 ERUs. And so that's the 3-tier single-family residential structure we looked at. We looked at also another rate structure alternative we looked at was to add a 4th tier for single-family residential, which calculates the largest single-family residential parcels on a parcel-by-parcel basis by looking at the total imperviousness on the parcel and dividing that by the 3,300 square feet. And so I'll show you, essentially anything that is not residential is calculated in that method. So for instance, commercial, institutional, if we have a store that's, for example, 10,000 square feet, you divide it by the square footage of one ERU, and you get 3 ERUs that would be applied to that commercial property. And that approximately that generates the same runoff as 3 standard households. So this summarizes the rate structures we looked at. I've pretty much described that too, I think. But the first 2 looked at impervious area statistics. The second 2 looked at gross parcel area, including both pervious and impervious. And I also just described the 3 versus 4 residential tiers.
Excuse me, just to Glenn's point, if there's 44,000 square feet in an acre, and so you're saying that so if you have a piece of property on a half acre, that's 22,000, which is 7 or 8 units.
Yes, and we'll get to that. What you're talking about is the gross parcel approach, which includes pervious area. And I think what you're getting at is maybe a reason not to go with one of those rate structures.
All I'm saying is that, well, I can have half acre and have a tennis court or whatever in coverage, and I presume that's impervious. So I could have an estate with those kind of, or I could have a stable there, which is part of the property that's not commercial. All I'm saying is that if you're limiting it to, if I had such a property, I would have a maximum of how many units under the 3-tier approach?
Well, the 4th tier makes those accommodations.
That's what, but...
Under the 3-tier approach, yes, what you're saying, I didn't actually delineate for the 3-tier approach, it would be properties greater than the 4,000 square feet would all be assigned 1.42 ERUs. So the property you're talking about would be assigned 1.42 ERUs for the
instead of 7.
Yeah, it may be. That's probably, it may be as high as that.
I understand. I just wanted to
you're right.
make that point in terms of.
No, that's a good observation.
And I don't know how many. Looking at your distribution on an earlier chart, was that only residences, or your bar chart that showed the distribution?
Oh yes, those were single. That was for coming up with the standard for runoff, which was from only single family properties. I'll tell you what, you guys are. You've got a lot of good questions, and I think we'll definitely get to those. I'll probably get through this general part, and then we can get back to that as well.
All right.
Is that okay?
That's fine.
Okay.
It just struck me with some of the questions. And
yeah, good. Okay. So the methodology I just described got us to the base ERUs for the parcel, and these in the preliminary evaluation analysis. These are applied across the parcels within the city based on land use. And so there will be refinements to that when we get into actually formulating the rate structures and the fees for each property. But so still talking about the methodology that we used, and this is also a similar methodology that's used when it's actually implemented. But this is what we use for estimation purposes. Credits to parcel for private or on-site stormwater management systems that are privately maintained. A fraction of the total ERUs for that property is deducted from the total number of ERUs that was calculated. And adjustments are made for certain properties. For example, a property that the backyard drains directly to the lagoon, and the front yard drains to the city system. There are adjustments for that as well. And then that gets us to the billed ERUs for each parcel. So these figures show, they provide some insight on applying the ERUs across the property types. So you see the pie chart on the left shows the total land acreage within the city, how the land uses are distributed. And 15% is vacant and unimproved, but a minimal amount on the right you can see is impervious area, the total imperviousness across the parcels in the city. And a minimal amount of that is vacant and unimproved. Whereas I'll also point out commercial is about 8% of the total land area, and 24% of the imperviousness across the city limits is commercial. So that's a major impact from commercial imperviousness on the amount and the water quality of runoff. So now we're getting into some of the results of our estimates. The resulting total billable ERUs are approximately the same for each alternative, roughly the same. So depending on how you slice it differently with the different rate structure alternatives, gross parcel area, imperviousness, it's roughly the same number of billable ERUs are projected and the same amount of revenue from the stormwater utility. However, the distribution of ERUs amongst the property types varies by alternative, which was why I just showed those pie charts to kind of get you thinking about that. The ERUs, these are distributions of the ERUs across the types of property. So you can see commercial is 25% and vacant and unimproved is a minimal amount for using the impervious area only basis. Using gross parcel area, commercial is 15%, vacant and unimproved is 8%. And we can come back and look at these more. We'll just keep going. So impervious parcel area basis, we're going to look at the pros and cons for each of these two approaches. The impervious parcel area basis is more simple, it's more defensible, and it's much more common for an ERU approach in Florida. It does not bill vacant and undeveloped property, so that's a con, but it could also be considered a pro in that arguably it could be less fair to bill those properties a high amount of ERUs. So less ERUs are billed to properties with high gross area but low impervious. Like the golf courses would be billed less under this. And looking at the gross parcel basis, it could be considered more hydrologically accurate, as we had started to talk about. That may not necessarily be true within the city of Vero. Vacant and unimproved properties are included in the billable ERUs. And so some of the drawbacks are that there's complexity in including the pervious areas. As far as keeping the database updated and streamlined, there's potentially some more administrative work there. Less ERUs are billed to commercial and institutional and other properties with large impervious area and larger runoff and water quality impact on the city system.
Excuse me. I know I keep interrupting, but if there is a park that has parking lots and is not developed, does that count as impervious in this? Because we have hundreds of acres of parks with parking lots and perhaps on the beach side. And so my question is that counted as developed or undeveloped?
That is, I'll tell you about the imperviousness situation with the data that exists right now. The building impervious areas throughout the city are defined. There's a comprehensive coverage for all the parcels. All the building area imperviousnesses are defined. The non-building imperviousness, including parking lots, and that all of those kinds of things. That was where the sampling came in. So a park would presumably not have, we would not be accounting for the parking areas in the parks at this point.
That's just to clarify, because we
can talk about, I know that Brett's wanting to talk more about this, and so we'll.
You mean they're not included even if they're paved?
Yeah, we'll talk about this more. I know Brett Brett was instrumental in defining the approach, and so there are reasons for everything here. So. Yeah, sure. That sounds great. That way we're going to transition to Camille after this.
Brett Cunningham with Jones Edmonds, part of the collective water team. So just adding to what Amelia said and getting back to your comment about the 20 parcels, for residential, for all the parcels, really, it's important to understand that there is some record of imperviousness from the property appraiser's data. What we don't have is a complete record of all the imperviousness. So what that analysis was trying to do was to fill in the gaps. So for instance, for residential, a typical residential within the city might have about 3,500 square feet of imperviousness. And of that 3,500, maybe 2,500 to 3,000 is accounted for already in the property appraiser's data. So we did the sampling to try and estimate what that gap was. So that was that portion of it. And then for the non-residential, for the part that wasn't accounted for, we also did some sampling to try and come up with that estimate. Ultimately, you may want to do something different, but the purpose here was to try and do something fairly quick to come up with a good estimate of what those number of ERUs were.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you. So Camille will talk now about the bill of collection methodology and some of the considerations for the two main options we looked at.
My name is Camille Tharp. I'm with Government Services Group out of Tallahassee, and we're dealing with the billing and collection method. I do want to add on to one other thing regarding the sampling. Remember, we're just hired, and we've done kind of the first pass at all the data. Certainly, as you decide to move forward, if you decide to move forward, there'll be a lot more rigorous analysis of the impervious area information, and because eventually if those properties get a bill, you're going to want to have that information be correct, and we'll also give those properties an opportunity to tell us that we're wrong. So they'll get a bill and they'll say, this is your impervious area, and they'll have the ability to come in and prove that, well, this really isn't what we see. For example, a gravel driveway, things like that. So the information and the approach we've done right now as far as statistics and the sampling would be further massaged as you move forward if you decide to move forward. Okay? Does that help? There are basically two kinds of methods to collect these assessments. There really are three, but I'm going to talk about two. One is the ad valorem tax bill using the uniform method prescribed by the statutes, or the utility billing method, which is the method you use to bill a lot of your other utilities. I'm going to talk about the pros and cons of both of them. And by the way, the third method is called the separate bill. And the separate bill is actually just sending a bill to the property, and that has all sorts of issues with it. It's not recommended here because you have two strong methods to collect it if you decide to move forward. However, the separate bill could be used in cases where you might not have met some statutory deadlines to put it on the tax bill this year, or you might have some issues with putting it on your utility right away. So you could send a separate bill for an interim period, and then eventually roll this onto the tax bill or the utility bill in future years. And that is used a lot in a lot of places where we find that just things didn't get done in time as far as legal requirements, and we use that as an alternative. Also understand that all three of these methods could be used together. So it's not a one size and you have to go that way. And in some cases we have what we call bifurcation, where we send a tax bill to some properties and we send a utility bill to others, or we send a tax bill to some and we send a separate bill to others. So make sure you don't close the door on one just thinking that we just have to go one way.
Is that constitutionally defendable?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. So the tax bill collection method is what they call the uniform method of collection. It's prescribed by statutes, Section 197.3632, which which in 1987, the Florida legislature gave cities and counties the ability to use the tax bill to collect assessments without the permission of the property appraiser and tax collector. Prior to 1987, if you went to them and said, I want to use the tax bill to collect a road assessment or a sewer assessment, they could say no, and you'd have to walk away. But in 1987, they changed that rule, and because of that, because you are now doing it almost without their permission, you still have to notify them, but there are a lot of hoops you have to go through also to kind of satisfy them that you know what you're doing. So the tax bill has the highest collection rate. It's a 95 to 98% collection rate because just like taxes, if you don't pay your tax bill, which you have to pay it all. You can't just pay just your taxes. You can't just pay just your assessments. If you don't pay them, then it actually ends up going through the tax certificate sale, which is a 2 or 3 year process where eventually, in a very short time, the government gets their money because someone has paid those taxes on behalf of that delinquent property owner. It is a positive to that is that there is one bill with all your charges if you're using it for assessments. You are using the tax roll data from the property appraiser, and you're using it in all these cases, but it's a stronger relationship between your data you're using and your collection mechanism when you're using the tax bill. The best thing about the tax bill, I think, is that the revenue is received within 6 months of the start of the fiscal year. You know, if you pay in November, you get a 4% discount. If you pay in December, you get a 3% discount. Those kinds of discounts will still apply to the assessments. So the good news is by March, you're getting 90-some% of your revenue, and you have that in hand in advance of the rest of the fiscal year. So that is a real positive. The negatives to the tax bill are, again, the strict statutory requirements regarding the public notice and the process. Again, because the legislature wanted to protect the property appraisers and tax collectors, they've put in a lot of hoops, a lot of steps. And if you miss one, you miss the opportunity for the whole year. There are strict statutory timeframes. You have to have everything done by September 15th every year. And we believe it's not useful for government property. And the reason we don't think it's useful for government property is, remember, the way the collection mechanism for this is to sell a tax certificate. Well, you can't sell a tax certificate on City Hall. You can't sell a tax certificate on the school board. So we think it's cannot be used for government property. Contrast that to the utility bill, which I know you all have a very strong utility billing mechanism.
It's ad valorem, so therefore it's tax deductible.
It's not ad valorem. It's a non-ad valorem special assessment. Now, for commercial properties, it is a taxable business expense. For your residential properties, it may not be. And I'm not a tax person as far as I'm not a income tax person. So, that $60 that you might pay or the $100 you might pay a year may or may not be be able to be used against your taxes. That would be something each individual property owner would have to deal with their taxes. Okay. Utility bill, the positives are your deadlines are set by local government. You can start it tomorrow. If you are ready to go, you can start it tomorrow. Your time frame, again, is set by local government. It is a little easier to charge your exempt property, your government property, and in fact, there's places in the state where stormwater assessments are collected on the utility bill to government properties, and there's no issues. And so you may even be able to use it for government property. The negatives to the utility bill collection method is it is sometimes difficult to correlate your utility accounts to your property uses. And that has to do with the fact that you could have the strip shopping center of Publix and all there in there. Well, on your utility billing system, each one of those buildings or businesses could have a separate account number, right? But on the tax roll, that could just be one single parcel. So there's the first year there's a little bit of process you have to go through to make sure that you're assigning the proper amount of impervious area to each one of your two utility accounts. But once you do that, it's done. So just that first year issue, but it's done all over the state, not insurmountable. There are some issues about collection for non-payment. There's the whole issue about can you shut off water or electricity for non-payment of stormwater? And you have to be very careful about how you construct your payments and how you construct how people pay so that you're not in violation of any constitutional issues. The utility bill may get crowded. The utility bill, you really can't send it to vacant or unoccupied property or those without a utility account or your properties that are not in use right now. They've moved out and they've just got nothing going on there. In those cases are places where you may decide you want to use your bifurcation and maybe send the tax bill to those properties. The other, what I think is somewhat of a negative, is that the revenue is received on a monthly basis. So you're going month to month on your budgeting and your revenue, as opposed to getting it all earlier in the year. So with that, unless you have any questions, I think I'm handing it back.
I just have one question. Excuse me.
What did you say the third method was? I didn't get it.
Separate bill. It's basically just taking the account and sending you a bill and hoping you'll pay it.
Well, who would you send it to?
Either to the property. You could send it to the property owner of record on the tax roll, or you could send it to the utility account owner of record on the. Either of those is possible. The problem with the separate bill is the collection. You have to take them to court, lien their property, go through that foreclosure process, and it's your collection rate on the separate bill is about 75%, as opposed to these being a lot higher.
You said 75%?
About 75%. That's what I would say. Because, and the other thing we do when we do a separate bill, even on an interim basis, is what we might do is send the separate bill for 1 year, and then the next year roll it onto the tax bill. And if there are any delinquent accounts from the separate bill, we will put them on notice that if they don't pay those amounts by a certain period of time, then last year's delinquent amount plus this year's new amount is going to both go on their tax bill. So you can be made whole using the separate bill and transitioning it to the tax bill within a year.
Aren't your real estate tax bills are paid in arrears, right? But this would not be? This
would be paid in advance. It's funding the next fiscal year. And really, what that means, what the property taxes say is whatever is on the property as of January 1st of this past year is what they're going to be charged for. So that's what the arrears part of it is. But really, when you're setting your budget and you're doing your information, you're really funding the next fiscal year. So for purposes of proration, for closings and stuff, we always tell the real estate and the title people, just go ahead and prorate it the same way as taxes. It's hardly, significant to do it any other way.
Given your position on the 75 versus 95, that means if we move to the utility building, we really need to adjust. 75% was separate bill. Utility bill is exactly what you do right now, which is probably what, 90? 93%. So it's not the 75%.
No, 75 separate bill.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, 93% is utility bill.
And that was just between 90 and 90.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's not as good as the 9
Okay, but it's not 75%.
No, it's not. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I was answering the question about separate bill.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
That would depend. The utility collection method. Again, what we have now is a situation where we're not dealing with the problem with turning off services. So it may change.
It could change it.
Stormwater too.
Yes.
That's the other.
Yeah, there is an issue with the connectivity of stormwater with your other services.
I understand. Trying to mesh the two systems.
Right.
I understand. Yeah.
Okay.
Does the billing methodology correlate with the manner in which the city actually handles stormwater? You may know that specifically our city does not have a separate stormwater utility at this time.
Right.
And it's my understanding that would require a public referendum. So at this time, it's handled through Public Works. So does this billing methodology that you're proposing in any way take that into consideration?
It doesn't. It has nothing. The collection method is really your choice. It's what you decide is best for the city, and it really the utility part of it. I think we have many situations where it isn't a separate utility. It hasn't been created. It is just part of Public Works.
Well, may I ask then what your instructions were? You received instructions from City Council then, is that correct, or from Public Works? From where did your instructions come, and what were they? Were you told that there would be a tax increase to handle this? Or,
No.
All these calculations.
Excuse me. I think, Monty, could you perhaps address the issue of what it is and what it isn't in terms of who's going to manage a proposed and where the manpower is going to come from?
If the stormwater utility is enacted, it would still be managed from Public Works with the same staff that we have today. There would be no additional staff required for the implementation of the stormwater utility. The billing method would be selected, and finance would help us prepare those bills if they're done with the utility bills, or help us get the information to the property appraiser if it's done for the non-ad valorem.
So essentially, the stormwater is just a funding mechanism that's going to be managed by Public Works.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
If I may, because I think Laura brought up a good question in addressing what instructions we're giving to the consultants. The only instruction was the feasibility of a stormwater utility and the design of a stormwater utility. We did not go into them about referendums or anything else. They're looking at it from an engineering and scientific method as opposed to the decisions we will have to make.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. And one of the reasons why I asked was within this preliminary study, they're recommending advertising it to the public. And of course, as you know, you'd have to be careful about that, because if it were to go to a referendum, advertising it is prohibited. That's my understanding.
The key is advertising is information. This is advertising as defined in the study.
This meeting today, you mean?
This meeting is. This is a public information meeting. That's all we do. Take the STEP system as an example. When we went and had neighborhood meetings to talk about the STEP system, that's what we're talking about, information, and tell people what it is that we're doing. And so we're not running ads, please support the stormwater utility, where we would run ads and have meetings that said, come here for more information as to what a stormwater utility is. And so that's what we would be doing for public information and distribution to the public.
No, thank you for clarifying that.
Okay, thank you, Jim. So this is, I think, essentially the last slide. From all of this, and in discussion with the city, Henry Thomas with PRMG met with Monty and Cindy to confirm some of the approaches for funding. And so looking forward to fiscal year 2016 through 2020, there's a projected $5.7 million in total expenditures from stormwater utility rates. That includes some funding for vehicle purchases, as well as around $4.8 million for stormwater capital improvement projects, which includes the repair and replacement and water quality projects. And a portion of that is anticipated to come from grant funding, which this utility will provide matching funds for. So with that, back to the recommended decisions that we were wanting the commissions to make today. Need to make a decision to proceed with this or not, and then also the rate structure and billing methodology. And we can talk more about the rate structure and billing methodology. I have the team here to answer questions with respect to our approaches, and so.
When you say decide to proceed, are you referring to the study itself?
To proceed with implementation.
How much money has been spent thus far in the study itself?
We're at about the 50% portion of the project. We issued a scope of services to them, and the first action item was to come present the preliminary findings. That's about 53, Cindy, I think is the number for the somewhere in that neighborhood that we've expended to date, $53,000. If we're going to go forward with the stormwater utility, it would take the study through its final phases and would be in the low 100s to finish, but we would have then a product, if we decided to move forward, a product that we could actually implement as a stormwater utility. But if we're not going to go forward, then we draw a line here and that's where we stop. So that's what we need action item from, is we're looking for a recommendation from you folks to take to council, is do we go forward and pursue this stormwater utility, or do we stop here? If we're going to go forward, we'd like to get your recommendations on the methodologies for the rate structure.
And if we were to stop here, then what does that mean?
We would take your recommendation to City Council, and they would help.
I'm sorry, what?
We would take your recommendation to City Council, and they would ultimately have to make the decision.
Monty, could you go back one time on a slide that I thought was sort of skimmed over, where you discussed the actual infrastructure that's in place, how long it's been there? Could we hear a little bit more about the depth of the problem?
Sure. There's a couple slides that we'll look at. But as we pointed out through the whole process, we started out showing the aerials of the early 40s, and as we started moving through the development of the city, as that infrastructure got placed into the ground, the bulk of it was, as we saw those slides in the early 90s, most of our city was developed. The infrastructure is in the ground. So it's being installed, from the 50s, when we really started having our development boom, through the 90s. So that infrastructure is of an age that was installed then. As the materials that we've used have gotten better over time. The materials that we were putting in the ground in the 70s might have had a 20-year life, the old asphalt-coated metal pipes. Mm-hmm. The ones that we're using today, the corrugated aluminum pipes, they'll have a 30, 40, depending on the water conditions, and then concrete material, depending on the makeup of the water that it's in, it can last 50, 60 years.
So the backbone of the system, the newest concept of that would be about a 24-year-old or thereabouts?
Yeah, the stuff that was installed.
Going backwards to up to 50?
Yeah, 75.
Okay.
If you're talking about stuff that was installed in the 40s and 50s. We have when I first came to work here, we have a pipe that runs through downtown. We call it the townside sewer system, storm sewer system. It was an old ditch that used to parallel the railroad tracks, and it runs from basically 16th Street to the main canal, and where the old bakery was, right across from the Citrus Museum. We had a failure of that pipe, and it's about a 60-inch pipe at that point. Some of it is concrete, some of it is clay tile, and some of it are clay segments that are about 2 feet by 1 feet that are mortared in place. That collapsed one Friday afternoon, and we had a contractor in there repairing it on Saturday. So you never know when something like that's going to happen. You can do an inspection and it all looks good, but we do have that infrastructure that's aging. The stuff we've put in more recently, we're looking for that to last its 50 years as we try to design for.
Mm-hmm. Monty, question of clarification. The infrastructure that you show on the map, this is wholly within the city limits of Vero Beach?
Yes, sir. We're only talking about inside the city limits.
And is there a like system outside of the city limits so far as the management of stormwater? Or are we just talking about a solution within the city limits?
We're talking about maintaining the infrastructure that we have inside of our corporate limits. There's a need to do that. There's two components to it. One is the R&R that we talked about, $500,000 a year based on the value and the age, and then the water quality component of that. Outside of our corporate limits, Indian River County has a system. They do not have a stormwater utility. Fellsmere has some improvements. They have a stormwater utility. Sebastian has improvements. They have a stormwater utility. Okay. Usually when you have the more densely developed areas, you have a more densely developed stormwater system. All the development in the county, the new subdivisions that go in, have their own stormwater system, and after that 88 timeframe, they all had a water quality component to them. So the city was basically developed at that point. Outside the city limits, the development was not as completely developed. So the infrastructure outside the city has a water quality component on anything that was constructed after the mid-'80s.
Question of curiosity. So take US 1 for an example. Goes through the city of Vero Beach. It has obviously drainage that runs off that road system.
Yes, sir.
That drainage or that storm runoff goes into pipes, but then it becomes the responsibility of, or it's still
in the city limits. It's in our watershed, but the maintenance responsibility is the DOT for the US 1 system. We have worked with DOT over the last 10 or so years and have gotten all of the major outfalls that discharge into the lagoon treated with some type of baffle box on their systems that they included with projects as they move forward.
So they've been a partner in trying to assist the city in some of this quality of storm retention?
They have recognized the need for cleaning up the stormwater as it is discharged to the river if you push them on it.
They have TMDL allocations that they're going to have to meet also.
Supposedly, when the limits are adopted in the upcoming 2018. Yes,
right.
ma'am.
And that applies to the county as well as to the state roads?
Yes, sir. That would apply to everybody.
How is the infrastructure that's in place now paid for over the years?
The funding source for the infrastructure that we have in place has been paid for with sales tax revenue, the 1 cent sales tax, and any water quality projects. We have some grant funding in there. All the maintenance of those systems is just our regular ad valorem taxes that we pay our general operating expenses out of.
So I'm just wondering why we're going elsewhere and trying to come up with complications to pay the new infrastructure.
If you'll, Matt, when we showed the slide that had the possible places that we could get funding, we have the need for about $1 million a year in infrastructure. We can continue to get it from sales tax revenue as we have, or there's the only other two sources that I know of are increasing the ad valorem tax rate to pay for it, or enacting a stormwater utility. The stormwater utility would more fairly assess that to all the land and not just those that are on the tax roll.
If I may, excuse me, Monty, I'm interested in how within the structure incentives can be built in order to encourage responsible behavior. For example, in the case of a residence leaving the pea gravel in instead of putting in a paved bed or driveway, or at a commercial site installing or building initially pervious areas for parking instead of the traditional impervious.
Yeah, and the consultant pointed out, and they can talk to this in more detail, but there are credits that can be given. If a site was developed before 1988, when that legislation went in, they're not going to have a water quality management system on that site. If it's afterwards, if it's a newer project, they will be eligible for some portion of a credit, and I'll let those questions get directed to the consultant.
Monty, before you leave, when I looked at the revenue sources, what struck me was initially we got one that's called an outfall / BMP implementation. What are we talking about?
Water quality.
Because it's $1,750,000. It's a third of the revenue.
Water quality improvements. If we talked about right now, we have, Matt, go back to that pie chart. We have 34% of our city that already has some type of water quality treatment on the outfall before it discharges to the river. We've already affected some reduction in nutrients to the lagoon. if we want to continue that process, we're not mandated legislatively yet. We think that'll happen in 2018. But over the next 5 years, we're showing a need for about $2.3 million to get 53% of our city treated, and then after that, another 1.1 would get us up to 2/3 of all of our watersheds treated.
So this first line on the budget, it's $1,750,000, is really for that.
If it's a water quality, yes. If that's what it says,
It says outfall BMP.
Yes, that's water quality. Yes,
Right.
sir.
Right. But also the study sort of suggests that there will be some need for staff to help mitigate some of these credits that have to be done property by property, correct? Or are you going to be able to handle that within the...
Well, Camille, you want to address that?
Yeah, it's incumbent on the property owner to apply. They're not going to, and then they just...
I understand, but somebody's going to have to...
They'll have to produce some information, their own engineering reports and things like that.
Somebody's going to have to manage that type of...
They will. There'll be some part of that.
Will have to be.
And it'll be probably a 1-year big deal, and then after that, not so bad.
Depend on the billing method.
Right.
Finance and customer service.
Right.
Yeah, that would be done with existing staff.
And then, Monty, there's about almost $1 million in there for new equipment. Is that because we haven't replaced equipment years back?
And that's over a 5-year cycle.
Yeah, it's pretty heavily, you know.
And what that pays for is our street sweepers, our VACCon machine that we go out and actually, you put these baffle boxes in.
Yeah, I've seen that.
They're not one and done. You have to go back, and we go on a quarterly basis and remove that material. We're keeping track of that. We're hopefully going to be able to do some testing to actually compare the actual results to what is prescribed. So that's what
I've seen some of them installed in our neighborhood, and then a couple months later, I've seen some of them taken out as if they're maybe not working quite the way we thought they were going to work. I don't know, but
are you referring to the
baffle boxes? You know, over the drain pipes.
Now, the baffle box is a structure in the ground.
The one that's over the storm drain, yeah.
We are working to try to
keep the leaves from flowing.
Right, but this is a new product that we are using, this FlexiPave material, which is a porous type material that we're placing over the inlets.
Right, I've seen that.
And we've had some clogging with it. We're changing up the aggregate size, and we're also trying to revise our design that has a high-level overflow. So if they do get clogged, the water would then flow into the drain as well. But there's no fail-safe on a system that's built out. There's no.
I understand.
It's a retrofit.
But we're testing some product. I can see that around the city.
Yeah.
Correct?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, that's what it looks like.
Can I see that chart again? The pie chart that shows the property impervious and pervious.
As Matt's pulling that up, I can say a couple more things about the process for credits and any adjustments to parcels. If you were to drive around a newly developed area, you would see almost all of the private property has a stormwater pond throughout Florida. And when you drive through Vero, you won't see that. And it's very difficult, actually, to find a private stormwater pond in the city. So what we want to do is we want to encourage private property owners to put in place best management practices to treat and attenuate stormwater runoff on their own properties. And so there would be a level of detail in that would be fair, but also simple enough to administer, back to that topic from one of the first slides. So, and if you're wanting to hear more about that, I know that Brett could probably speak more to what other communities have done, and we could get into that more if you want to. Just let me know. But otherwise, we'll go on to
I have a general question.
Yeah.
For my own information here. Does that screen there, that pie on the left, does that mean what it says, total land acreage?
Well,
33%
that's
owned by the city?
the airport is a pretty big.
Yeah, that's true.
So, and this kind of brings up
a
this brings up a point with respect to the billing method. If you're not able to bill the government properties through the non-ad valorem tax assessment method. That takes out quite a lot of ERUs. So in order to get to the projected revenue estimates that we were looking at, it would change things quite a bit. So if you go with the utility bill, so that's kind of another consideration there. If you go with the utility bill method, then you can.
The point that I'm making, regardless of the type, you look at the right-hand side of that chart. If it is deemed that this work, the council deems that this work should be done in the city, that is to do the storm water projects, if that is deemed to be necessary, and you don't have the stormwater funding mechanism, then you look at the right-hand side, and clearly you do it through ad valorem taxes, 100%. Therefore, those items such as the city-owned 19%, those institutions, 10% that are nonprofit and non-ad valorem tax paying, the IRC and the school board, and perhaps some others, all of that would be non-taxable, and hence those who are both the commercial and residential are going to have to pay taxes in order to, if it is deemed necessary, to go forward with the saving our lagoon and our stormwater. That's the only point I wanted to make.
Could I bring up something? All of this project so far is dealing with the city as it is now. How much is there a comprehensive plan for the city and for land usage which should be taken into account in order to prevent excessive stormwater being channeled into the lagoon, which doesn't go through our current system? Or how do we account for growth with our system or with this proposed system?
That is regulated in our stormwater management ordinance that was adopted in the mid to late 80s and updated in 2010, and that sets out for how stormwater is managed on new projects. Mm-hmm. So any of the undeveloped properties that are developed now have to meet the requirements of that, and they take care of the amount of stormwater discharged, the quantity, mm-hmm. and the quality of that stormwater, so they have to treat it before they can discharge it.
Yeah, I've even seen some of my friends have done some add-ons to their house recently, mm-hmm. and there's now a rule in place that says if they do a certain amount of add-on to the house, they also have to plan for water retention on that site. And some of those sites are 70 foot wide by 130 deep, and all of a sudden that stormwater retention is a major issue on those properties. Mm-hmm. So there is this stormwater situation can be a limiting factor on expanding footprints on existing sites. Am I saying that right, Monty?
You are. That is correct.
It looks like it mathematically to me. And it may very well, which we have to be careful about when these construction costs are fiddled with, it may very well begin to adversely impact the ability to maintain some houses and make them more viable to the current environment versus what they were built like in 1950 or 58 or 60. So there is a trade-off going on here. It's complicated. People don't recognize it, but it's going on. Is that right, Monty?
It's exactly right. If you let's look at a larger scale, you take a piece of property that's developed today, a commercial site, they're going to have to dedicate X number of percentage of that land for stormwater management. If you look at the Miracle Mile Shopping Center that was developed, as you saw in the aerials, in the 60s, they developed 0% of that land for stormwater management. So they were able to use all of that land for a commercial investment, for a return on investment. But today, through legislation, we all recognize there is a need to do that, and it's part of the development cost.
Yeah, if you want to see an interesting one, it was done on Commerce Street, and one of the air conditioning guys did it. And it was clear when you looked at it, they built a double parking, which really meant there was about a 2 foot in there that they were retaining water within, sort of like a well, right? And it was across the whole property. So the parking deck became the water retention pond. A very expensive transaction.
Yeah, and you'll notice there's some properties that come to mind. State Road 60 between 27th Avenue and 43rd Avenue, you'll see they're a little higher than the properties around them. What they've made the conscious decision, instead of having an open pond and losing that square footage of land, they put the stormwater management system under the parking lot.
Right.
Raise the parking lot up in the building. So they have that treatment system. You just don't see it. It's not exposed to the...
That's what I'm saying. There's a cost going on here that's being sort of shifted more into new construction. And there's a little bit of adversity affecting older residential neighborhoods.
The way our code reads now for a redevelopment of a commercial property is they have to the maximum extent practical, come into compliance with the code. So there's some give and take when you're meeting with a person to do a redevelopment.
Yeah.
So
on the utility fees, I'm not clear if we're leaning toward putting it on the utility as a utility. What happens with rental units? The ERUs are assigned by parcel. Utility bills are by individual user. How is that?
Again, if you use the utility billing mechanism, then that individual rental unit will prorate that parcel's impervious area on ERUs to those individual units, and the utility bill, the renter will pay it if they are the utility owner, and in the tax bill collection method, the property owner would pay it, and then he would actually have to pass that through in his rent.
And we would have to do that unit by unit?
Correct.
You're not going to use averages for that?
No. Well, there's different ways to, it gets into a lot of complexity as far as if it's a condominium, you're going to take the condominium building and split it between all the units. If it's a multifamily apartment, you may just do it on an average. So there's things that we can do either way. So there's not just one answer there.
The reason I'm troubled is that two of the criteria were that this be fair and it be simple.
Right.
And they conflict a lot.
Right.
Question on
walk that line all the time.
how much of our current property that's been developed, particularly to commercial, that falls under the time frame that they put in stormwater utility solutions versus the ones like the shopping centers that have large parking lots but no retention ponds. Can you give me something of a mix of how many of those are going to be?
Other than the aerial that shows there in the late 90s that most of the city has already been developed, I don't have a percentage on that. I could get that.
So even though they are contributing more to the stormwater issue, they can only be billed on the same billing level as one that.
No, when we actually, if we move forward and we actually calculate the ERUs to be assigned to each parcel, those that were developed after that would get some form of credit. Camille, am I saying that correct?
True. Yes. If they have a stormwater in place. Right. Yeah, Brett can talk.
Yeah, so what we did, we looked at the data that Monty was talking about, and we've tagged the parcels that we believe have stormwater treatment on them already. And for those, we've applied a reduction, and there's a couple different reductions based on what method you use. And so that's factored into the number of ERUs that we estimated already. So we're already providing, those properties are already being given a mitigation credit for having an on-site privately maintained stormwater system.
Sir, for the public, could you say what firm you're with and what tasks your firm in this team effort took on?
Brett Cunningham with Jones Edmonds, and we've done...
Yeah, so Jones Edmonds took the GIS-based information that was available, parcel data, and looked at the parcel statistics that I talked about. I'm local. I'm born and raised in Vero, so I was looking at their approaches and QCing, quality controlling them to make sure that they made sense for Vero Beach, which they do. And the part that Jones Edmonds did was to go through and look at the different rate structures, assign the number of ERUs to each parcel across the city. Now, this is a estimate for the purpose of billable areas. Things like the multifamily residential would be refined further prior to implementation. And in addition, the credits that we've assigned to the parcels, that was looking at it not in detail and it would be looked at in further detail, potentially even needing to pull permits and see, just because it was built after 1972, we made that assumption. It is conservative. There may actually be less mitigation credits to these properties because a lot of them may have an ERP that was put in place after 1972, but did not actually provide the full water quality of a site that was. So for instance, if there's a site in the city that was vacant and it was developed in 1990 or 2000 or last week, it's going to have a substantial amount of water quantity and water quality treatment up to the current standards. Whereas if you have a site that was commercial and it was 90% impervious, and then they redevelop it, and it's, or even if it were 50% impervious, then it went to 90% impervious. When they redeveloped it, it's not going to have the full, necessarily have the full water quality attenuation and pollution control that it should. So that there's some details there that would need to be worked out when we get into the actual construction of the rate structure prior to implementing.
And so what really in all this process, what we're trying to do is to get an answer that's close. It's not going to be 100% perfect, but trying to get to an answer or numbers for you to evaluate that are pretty close without spending a lot of time getting everything exactly perfect. So for instance, when we're estimating around 17,000 ERUs, we're comfortable that it's probably going to be, say, plus or minus 500, something like that, as opposed to plus or minus 2,000 or 3,000 ERUs. So that in general, that's kind of all of our analysis. That's the kind of the level of accuracy we're dealing with.
But as you read the study you sent us, it's pretty clear you have decided, or the recommendation is that we're going to go with program 1B. That's what you're sort of recommending, and you're sort of recommending that we go with the utility billing system. That's clear in the documents, correct? Or I'm misreading it? It is.
That is the recommendation that we put in the document. That was for staff. Our recommendation to them, based on, like I said, the number of billable ERUs that they would lose if they went with the non-ad valorem tax.
But you're going to have to defend what you're selling to the city, and that is where the thought process, we're saying 1B.
And with 1B, that's a recommendation. Any of those approaches are fine and are legally defensible. However, between 1A and 1B, it's up to you if you want to. It's up to the city to decide whether or not they want to explicitly calculate that top tier of residential, or if they want to assign everyone in the top portion just 1.5
It's unlikely the political elected will argue too much with the engineering staff. I mean, so you are recommending 1B and utility building system. That's the way it reads. Pretty clear.
Well, then,
That's our recommendation to city staff.
well, let's have the city staff respond to you, then, Glenn.
It clearly says
in their
that.
perspective.
That was our recommendation. We've discussed it.
I don't know
Is there
what city's
reasons
doing,
to
but-
consider either one?
Well, it's a recommendation to the staff. The staff is analysis, and then Jim can respond.
First of all, let me clarify something. This is just the initial stage of this discussion. And what we're doing is coming to you and ultimately to the City Council. There's no reason to spend any more money on this project if we don't want a stormwater utility. This gives you an outline, justification, and all of that in the exercise and the process. The staff has no position on the stormwater utility. Our stormwater utility efforts, we're showing you a funding mechanism that we think is more fair than the ad valorem tax, as an example. So it's a fairness issue from our perspective, but we have historically relied on ad valorem taxes, so therefore, from our standpoint, if that's the history and the future of the way we want to do this, that's totally a decision to be made. We're just telling you that if we're going to bring our stormwater utility and maintain it as it's going to be required, in our opinion, to be maintained in the future, it's going to cost more money. It was much easier back in the old days to dig a ditch and have the water drain to the lagoon. And then we went from there to putting a pipe in the ditch and letting it drain to the lagoon. And then we had to start implementing regulations that imposed stormwater activities on developers. That wasn't quite so easy because we fought over the square footage that they were losing, and when you price out a commercial piece of property, everybody wants a return on investment per square foot. But it was something that we have implemented and over time has been accepted. Now what we're seeing going into the future is a much more stringent and involvement of the federal and state governments in this process. That's going to add cost. I don't know any other way around it. I had never worked for a city till I got to Vero Beach, which we now measure the tonnage we take out of our street sweeper in order to try to get credits for removing debris that ultimately would wind up in the lagoon. Again, that's an extra step. In the old days, you sent out a street sweeper, it emptied, you took the material, you dumped it out, took it to the landfill, and everybody was happy. In today's world, you look at it and you measure it because it's part of your overall game plan in order to address concerns that we in Vero Beach, and I think throughout the Treasure Coast, have about what's going into the lagoon. And so we're really presenting this stage of the study, and from a finance standpoint, I don't want to speak on behalf of Cindy, but at least from my standpoint where I have to sign the checks, if this is something we don't want to do, tell us, let's get off this horse and we'll go find another horse to get on. And so that's really where we are. But we had to spend the money in order to educate you all and the City Council as to what a stormwater utility really was. We know we have neighboring cities that have stormwater utilities, and we know the county does not. So you have a diversity right here in Indian River County. But again, if we're going to try to address what we think are going to come as future issues on stormwater utility, this is a mechanism. This is a vehicle by which to do it. Otherwise, we find other options.
Jim, so I can understand this. Could this just be handled under Monty's department, or are we actually talking about forming a whole other entity within the city structure to handle this?
My challenge to Monty, to the consultants, we pay no labor cost out of the stormwater utility. His department absorbs it. We have the engineers that are already there. But we will be contracting out jobs. When we come across a pipe that needs to be replaced, where we may have tried to do that with city crews, we will now do that under contracts in order to expedite and to make sure that it's done as the funds come in. So yes, we will. The plan is there will be no additional manpower accredited to stormwater utility as assigned by the city employee. There'd be no payroll checks written from the stormwater utility as it is designed today, subject to change by you or the City Council, obviously, but that was my challenge.
Thank you.
And Jim, as I've read it and I've heard before, this would be these funds would be dedicated exclusively for this use. It wouldn't bleed over into other divisions or...
That is correct. Think of this as impact fees. This stormwater utility by law has to be used to address that concern. If I take money from Publix or if I take money from the First Baptist Church, it's got to go to the point, and that's the fairness and the legality of what we're dealing with. But yes, and we would be audited. Our stormwater utility would be on an annual audit. It would be included in our audit to make sure that we are legally spending the money as prescribed by the code and the state law.
One benefit that I haven't heard mentioned, that if we go with the stormwater utility, then this comes off of the property tax, the ad valorem taxes. If we don't, if we leave it as is, that's part of the revenue the city has to raise.
Yes, sir. The ad valorem tax is our fundamental, only real source that the city council has.
These costs are going to continue no matter what we do here.
From every indication, and I believe some of the folks in this room are even more involved in it than I am, will tell you that...
Potentially changing the source.
Yes, sir. We're addressing the revenue to address a particular issue.
To clarify that about the source.
Well, you have sales tax as well, but the answer to the question is, but sales tax referendum as well, so we hopefully will address that. But
my understanding is you're not asking for any type of recommendation as to whether it should be ad valorem or utility. It's just a go, no go.
Yes, sir. We really have two questions. One, and if you answer it no go, then it stops here. We don't need any more answers. If it's a go, then we would like to get some recommendation as to how we do the billing method and that type of stuff.
I think there's a good bit more information that's needed. It sounds great to put it on utility, but when you think about how utilities are distributed, you've got the owner of a piece of property. You could have multiple utilities off of one given property within the city. How do you allocate, if you're going to spread it over utilities, how are you going to allocate that cost?
That was what was previously discussed, that you have a condo complex. You can take a condo complex and it has so many EDUs on that property, and you divide it up among those ratepayers or those utility customers.
So you do the same thing in a shopping center?
Yes, sir.
Same approach?
Yes, sir.
And if it's utility billing, it'll run with your existing utility. We're not going to reinvent that. So however they're being billed for utilities, for example, you might send the utility bill to an association for condos. I don't know, or a homeowners association, or to the major tenant of a shopping center, and then they decide how they distribute it. So we will just piggyback what you're doing. And the first year, yes, it'll be a little complicated. But after that first year, it'll either of these mechanisms are easy after the first year.
It's important to know we already have a lot of those complications where you have a master meter for water and individual electric meters, and you have people coming and going from those complexes. You have the issues with the apartment complexes. And so we've been over the rough road, but I think as just indicated, the next, that first year of implementation, everything you do is going to have issues. Hopefully it won't be as bad as the garbage bins, but it will be that we have to answer questions which we'd be subject to make it work.
Question of curiosity, in looking over the estimated projected funding summary, there's a substantial amount of money in there for Vero Isles outfall. So as a private residential area, the city's going to take on the task of fixing their storm retention, or I'm not quite clear on that.
It's one of the projects that's identified in our capital program. But as we look at the city, and we've talked about numerous times, was developed before there were any water quality regulations. So Vero Isles is a prime example. When Vero Isles was developed, and we saw the slide where the canals were dredged and the seawalls were put in, that drainage system that was put in just included an inlet on each side of the street and a pipe that ran to the river. Once the subdivision is installed, the city takes those over for maintenance, as we do with a a subdivision that would be done today. So that is our system to maintain now. So the maintenance that has to be done there is to, number one, to keep the water quantity system working so that it drains the subdivision, but also to add some water quality that would treat the water before it is discharged straight to the river.
Is it fair to say the canals themselves are owned by the city, not by the homeowners? Development?
All of that land was owned by the city at one time, and the city still owns the submerged lands in the canals.
So the point is that the drainage goes to the canals, which are owned by the city.
The city owns the bottom land. It's still waters of the state.
But it does. My point is, to the chase, it's not owned by the homeowners. That's my point.
And I understand that. I guess, like, for instance, when you develop in the county, you have to put in your storm retention system. That storm retention system is maintained by that community. It's not turned over to the county. So it's an internal, with the association, through their fees to maintain that. It's an internal situation. But the city, in development rules, will accept the storm retention?
No, the previous ones, the ones prior to those adoptions, just like in the county, subdivisions that were done before those were enacted, the county maintains those systems. The new ones, they do not.
Gotcha.
So, Monty, I was fortunate to be able to go to the Indian River Lagoon Symposium at Harbor Branch recently, and there was a question about seagrass that was brought up, and sadly, I just want to report that the forecast for the lagoon is not good at all. Seagrass is not anticipated to recover in this time period, so more than likely we'll have these mandatory allocations. So I think that this is such an important thing for the city to move forward on. A couple of the things that I noticed, the projects that I saw from Bill's old report from July 2015 and the things you're talking about doing are relatively small projects. And for example, in the downtown area of Vero Beach, there's properties that have no space to do water retention on them. And so if we're going to do some water retention, we may actually have to purchase some land or allocate some city land to do some water retention. And another thing that's really being addressed in other counties along the lagoon and hasn't been addressed at all here yet is muck. And it's a little pointless, I think, to address the muck issue until we get what's going into the lagoon addressed. But at some point, we may need to do some muck dredging because now scientists have shown that muck, if it's left in the river, it just keeps stirring up and suspending all the nutrients. So all of our property level in this county, our quality of life, everything depends on the quality of the water going in and the quality of the lagoon. So I think this is a really important step in the right direction that makes it an equitable way to share the burden.
Judy's correct. There are a lot of problems facing us. Most of those problems, the muck problem, for instance, it's going to be a more regional solution to that. It's not going to be something that they're going to look to the city of Vero Beach or the city of Sebastian to solve that problem. That's going to take state and federal dollars. That's a huge project outside of the scope of this. I just want to touch on this, and then I think Cindy wants to clarify one thing. There are three components to our stormwater operation. The one is operation and maintenance. Okay, that's the $700,000 that we spend annually, and that's in people and maintenance, personnel cost, equipment cost, just the daily activities. Okay, that's paid for right now on your property tax bill through ad valorem taxes, and we allocate that through our budget process. The other two components are capital components. They are water repair and restoration and water quality. And those two components are what we're talking about, the need for a funding source, whether that funding source be additional ad valorem taxes levied or a stormwater utility. the staff's position is this work needs to be done. The funding mechanism is what we're seeing where we want to go forward to.
I want to add on to what Monty said, just to clarify this. So the situation that we're in right now, as Monty said, is all the staff and all the personnel costs are part of the city's general fund and are paid for with your ad valorem taxes. But when you get to the vehicles and the actual capital projects right now, those are part of what we call our Fund 304, which is funded by grants and mostly by 1 cent sales tax. We take in $2.4 million a year in 1 cent sales tax, and before we even start projects, we have $700,000 worth of debt service payments that we make out of that. We have another $400,000 to $500,000 of capital lease purchases we pay out of that. So annually, we have somewhere between historically $600,000 to $800,000 a year that we put into Fund 304 to do capital projects. All of our capital projects, all of the road paving, all the projects associated with some of the aging infrastructure we have in the recreation department, all of the stormwater, and all of the other kind of assorted public works projects that we do, sidewalks, etc. As you can see, that math doesn't really work when you start talking about $1 million a year solely for $500,000 just to maintain the system we already have, and another $500,000 to improve it to these upcoming standards. You look at probably we need to be spending between, I'm looking at Monty, $300,000 and $500,000 a year on road paving, again, to maintain the road infrastructure that we have. So really the whole impetus for discussing the stormwater utility came up when we started looking at the budget last season and the season before, and realizing that we had a tremendous pressure of capital projects on a very limited source of revenue. And so in the last few years, the council has had to make some pretty hard choices about what to fund and what not to fund, but the pressure has grown as we've seen, particularly the recreation infrastructure aging, as well as just pure failures in the stormwater system. The way the budget sits right now for 15-16, in anticipation of a conversation about a stormwater utility, we took essentially all of the stormwater funding out of Fund 304. We left about $50,000 in case something failed. So in the current fiscal year we're running in, we have all the funds available to us for capital projects completely budgeted out to road paving, to Leisure Square, to other things like that, with almost no money for stormwater, and yet we've had failures and have pressure on that money even in the current fiscal year. So again, a policy decision, but I think the impetus for this conversation was we have many, many capital projects and very aging infrastructure across the city and a very limited amount of funds to deal with it, and the question is, how do we increase those funding sources in the most equitable way? And then the last little wrinkle is the 1 cent sales tax that funds all these projects we're talking about is up for a vote to be renewed or not within the next year or so. And should that go away, again, the problem becomes even larger. So hopefully that clarifies the situation a little.
Yeah. Mark, we're going to get to public comment before we have any motions, but I want to continue with the discussion by the staff and from the commission members. So, Monty, please, you were getting up?
I left my...
If I may, I'd like to know what the procedure is, the mechanism going forward. I think that the document that is presented answers a lot of the questions that we have upon close reading, and it takes a while to go through it. I agree with Judy that this is an issue of worthy of the study. I think the study is well done as a first step. If all that is needed from us at this point is a green light in order to continue to refine this study and to come back at a later date with a more complete design, which can be, I understand it, even tweaked at that point, right? If we have concerns or modifications that we want to implement, then I'd like to see us move towards approval.
Well, I'll have a public comment, but my point, thank you, that Jim said he wanted it in two parts. One, go or no go, and second, with some specificity in terms of recommendations on the construct of the units and the amount of processing billing, and I'm uncomfortable with that. Personally, I think going forward, with what's been done so far is the right step. But going further than that and taking this preliminary report and then leaping to a conclusion, I think is somewhat premature, in my view. But I'm sorry, Mark, public comment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mark Mucher, 617 Indian Lilac Road. I'd like to back up a little bit to the go or no go. I want you all to remember that this whole scheme was initiated by 3 members of the City Council, all of which who have homes $750,000 and above. So they didn't want to have this done on an ad valorem tax basis like a lot of other communities do, and like we've done all the time up until this time. I don't want to pretend to know what they're thinking, but it sounds like they don't want to pay any more for their valuable, perhaps larger property than I do for my little 2-bedroom home. And so I'd kind of like to see what the charges would be to me or to the average homeowner, for example, on an ad valorem versus non-ad valorem basis. And both of the schemes are talking about here, the billing or the non-ad valorem tax bill assessment are could be considered non-ad valorem assessments. Another thing is, I'd like to know what the definition of stormwater discharge is. Again, looking at my house, I have a roof, I have a driveway, I even have a little shed, but I don't know where there's a city storm sewer inlet anywhere near my home, certainly not downstream from my home. And just the way my soil is, I've never had a puddle in my yard, even during hurricanes and major rain events. So I don't know whether I have any stormwater runoff or not. But like I say, I do have a roof. And so I expect, everybody's going to have to pay this one way or another. When you talk about fairness of the non-taxable agencies, and the city of Vero Beach has 40%. Are we going to send a bill to the city of Vero Beach?
Correct.
I don't think so.
Correct.
I don't think so, because they can't pay it, right? Well, yeah, but I mean, you don't have any extra money to pay for something like this. If you pay for it, it'll probably be out of the stormwater utility. Well, then you're going to have to raise taxes, raise ad valorem taxes to pay these stormwater assessments. Some people say churches are rich, some don't. Where's the school board going to get money to pay, substantial bills like this? What about other not-for-profits? Yeah, it's fair. I won't argue that, but I don't know where people are going to get the money. Individuals, businesses, yeah, they have to. It's a cost of living here and a cost of doing business. But other, governments and not-for-profits and things like that, I don't know where they're going to get the money.
Well, the city council makes that decision in terms of where they're going to get the money. They would vote it. They either vote it up or vote it down. And if it is going to go through and it's approved, then the money has to be provided, and it's going to be whatever those sources are.
Well, it may come out of our pockets. Then I'm just saying
that has to come from somewhere if it's approved.
Well, I understand, but I don't know that this is a very good idea, and maybe we ought to just bite the bullet and do it on an ad valorem basis. I'd like you all to think about that.
Thank you.
Mark, just to address Mark's issue, where it would be collected, we got to remember, general fund would probably be the smallest element of paying this stormwater utility. Water would pay it, wastewater would pay it, electric would pay it, the airport, 20%, a little over 20% of our entire area. So the airport would be responsible for that, not ad valorem taxes. But that's the bulk of it would be coming from utilities. And you're right, those who pay utilities or work at the airport would actually be paying it.
Go ahead,
Mr. Chairman, if I could just understand that statement again. Are you saying that if we didn't have this utility tax, and we went ahead with these proposed improvements to our stormwater problem, whatever they are, it would be paid, even though you're saying from ad valorem tax, it would come from taking money out of from the other revenues?
No, sir. I'm saying if this is implemented where you do it on the non-taxable properties in the city, the question was, are you going to have to raise taxes to pay the stormwater utility fee? I pointed out the answer is no, because under that condition, the electric department pays its own utilities, whether it's water, sewer, or electric. And we send bills. We process those bills. And so, for example, you take the wastewater treatment plant or the water treatment plant, we would be sending them a stormwater utility bill.
Does that answer your question, then?
Yes, sir.
We have any more discussion?
I have a sort of a statement here, too. The initial $51,000 for this study was done by the city council without any input from this group or any other group. They just made the authorization to spend $53,000. Now they come back to us and they want us to push the camel through the tent. And I have yet to hear that our city council is going to have the courage to pass through another $1 million increase to our taxpayers this year. Now, they got away with it last year. It was a sort of a brouhaha when we got there. But we raised taxes over $1 million last year. Now, my good colleague sitting beside me this year did a quick analysis of the city operating statements. And he suggested that we have $1 million of gas fuel costs in all of our budgets. Correct, Mr. Gorey?
Yeah.
And Mr. Gorey ran those numbers, and on his analysis, we could come through the year with a $600,000 to $800,000 savings in our gas fuel costs amongst all of our entities. Now, that would suggest that maybe at the end of the year, we have a drop-down revenue gain of $500,000 to $600,000 in more than a 1 year lower cost. Our gas costs are running the fuel, all the trucks around the city. So the question I'm having a problem with, do we need to be authorizing another $1 million tax increase there? And that's sort of what we're doing. If we say, go forward, yeah, they have to have the courage to pass it on, but are we really going to pass it on this year, or are we just going to eat another $50,000 and put it on shelf for a couple years and see what our operating statements do? Because remember, last year we passed the fuel cost. We passed $1 million on. And I know people don't want to talk about it, and I bring it up every time. We still have $15 million added to our balance sheet, $1.5 million a year for the last 3 years in post-benefits to our employees. We're not doing anything with that. Zip. So here we are talking about another tax increase, and that's really what we're talking about here. And I'm not disputing the fact that we need it. That's not my argument. I think we do need it. But do we need to do it now before our budgets are in place so we get a chance to review our operating statements? Is there a possibility that going forward, because of the great benefit of fracturing gas and oil, that we will have a sustained 3 or 4 years of lower fuel costs that we could allocate back to what we really need to do as capital structures without adding to the burden of taxes to our taxpayers.
Well, the only point I'd like to make, Glenn, on that analysis I did, the numbers are true, but the vast amount of expenses in fuel oil, over $2 million a year, is in the water sewer utility as well. So that is not in the general fund, but is in the water sewer. And then another one, which is amazing, is the marina spends an enormous amount.
But if it's
that's not all flowing to the general fund.
But Mr. Glory, the water and sewer, I don't see why we're sort of redefining things. We got a stormwater and we got a water and sewer. It's still the taxpayers' money.
No, it's the ratepayers when we're talking about the issue of fuel costs. That's what I'm addressing.
You're correct. It's the ratepayers.
Right.
But the ratepayers, you said, are pretty much in the city on the water side. All I'm suggesting is maybe time is here. Maybe we don't have to authorize it right now. Maybe we do have to look at our budgets again this year carefully and see if there's a way of handling more capital structure payments without adding to the burden of our ratepayers and our taxpayers.
I think we need to differentiate between operating costs, which are variable and outside of our control. Price of gas is controlled by the fact that there is a glut of oil on the market, and it could stop the day after tomorrow if Saudi Arabia decides that they don't want to keep pumping it. And fracking may or may not reduce our costs of overall fuel, but it's not the fracking gas is not going to power automobiles. So those operating costs are not something that we should be looking at lightly because they're really not under our control. Next year we might need $1 million in fuel costs for our vehicles. This capital project should be able to be funded on its own as a self-sustaining entity. And this is what is being proposed. And I think this is the direction we should go. And whether we need to do something with the city budget as a whole because of variable costs, which we'll only know about retroactively each year, that's a whole different discussion.
Victor,
in the final analysis, if we want to go ahead with this, and I think we need to go ahead with this because ultimately it is going to be mandated at some point, we have to fund it. And, that means tax increases for everybody. And basically the real question is, how do you allocate those increases as fairly as possible? Whether it's ad valorem or through a utility bill or whatever, or a mixture of those, don't know. I mean, I think that's something that the finance people need to look at. But I don't think we need to be tied into recommending one or the other exclusively. I don't know that we are really in a position to make that kind of a recommendation, and I'm not sure that we should make that kind of recommendation. I think our recommendation should be limited to, do we go ahead with this now when we do it by choice, or do we wait until it's imposed on us by the state and the federal government? And I think my own opinion is it's always better to do things by choice rather than by mandate.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I agree with a lot of the financial information that Glenn provided here. But I have a different take on this. I don't feel that the staff or any of these engineers in their reports have made the case for a go-ahead. Certainly not the case to go ahead now. I don't see any rush into this. And I'll play with some of their studies. The Public Works Department gave a nice presentation. If you look on page 8 of that presentation, this is their argument. This is their evidence. They go and describe the Humiston Park project, which is near and dear to my heart. It's in my neighborhood. And they call that a success story, and I think it is. And they talk about, before their project, all of those problems that existed, and then they have mentioned 21 recorded beach closures. I wasn't aware of that, but then they say after the project, there have been no beach closures. Okay, well, that's great, but they did that all without a stormwater utility tax. They did it in-house with general revenue funding, which is the way it should be. I haven't, at the start of Monty's presentation, he said what he's asking today is a reason. Do we want to go forward? Do we go or do we stop? And then right away they go into this idea of a methodology of collection, a methodology of a tax, and then the 3 types of collections: ad valorem taxation, utility statement, or a separate bill. That's not going into whether or not we need to even have a separate tax. I've heard from everybody speaking today 3 possible reasons. I don't think there's validity to any of them. I've just mentioned the Humiston Park. That was a success without an extra tax. Okay, then they always say, well, other cities have it. Fellsmere has it, a utility tax. Sebastian has it. Okay, those are different cities. The argument that I have, that I hear for this city having more employees than I feel it deserves to have, is that we're different. We're a different town. We're a different town than Sebastian, which I feel is a well-run town, very well-run financially. They don't have the number of employees that we have. And the argument that I hear from staff is, well, Sebastian is different. Vero Beach is a different town, therefore we need more employees. Well, that argument should be constant, you know. If we're different in a different city, then we don't necessarily have to do what Sebastian is doing in terms of a stormwater tax. The other argument, or the reason I heard, was Indian River Lagoon is in bad shape. And if we have this utility tax, we're going to improve the lagoon. I don't think this tax is going to have much of an impact on the lagoon. And everybody wants a clean lagoon. But that pollution in the lagoon is caused by the farmers having their fertilizer run off, the way those canals are structured. It's also caused in large part by our homes with defective septic tanks and having that run into the lagoon. I don't think this project, your proposed project, is going to have much of an effect on the lagoon. So I agree with Mr. Brevant. I don't see any reason to go forward with this at this time. I'd like to cut our damages right now.
Well, I don't, but that's a different opinion. But let me talk about Sebastian, and let's talk about the number of employees. How many employees does Sebastian have in their electrical system? How many do they have in their water system? How many do they have in their marina? How many do they have in the cemetery? How many do they have in their airport? Since they don't have those, and if you look at the majority of the employees in the city of Vero Beach, the greatest percentage of the employees, including solid waste, I'm sorry, I left that out, are in the enterprise funds. They're not in the general fund employees. So there's a vast difference when you talk about a comparison of the city of Vero Beach to Sebastian.
But you forgot to mention the police department. They have a lot less police officers, and they have a larger population.
Well, okay. I'll let the Please, Chief, present that.
I think we're getting off course a little bit here. Let's get back on the issue.
Well, I have three counterpoints to your statement. I think there's three really good reasons that just came to the top of my head about why we should move ahead. And one of them is because these nutrient reductions are going to be state mandated, that we're going to have to do. And in order to get grants to help us do it, we have to have funds set aside. We have to have designated funds to be the match. So that gives us this pool of funds to be the match. Another thing is this, by having the stormwater utility fee, it gives these existing businesses or properties that didn't meet the new regulations to have an incentive to go in and implement best management practices on their own in order for them to reduce their fee. And so the city can't physically go into that public shopping center and put stormwater retention in place on Miracle Mile. But with the fee, if their fee is determined to be high, and then they have these incentives where they could go in and create stormwater retention in some of the parking areas, set some part aside. There's a lot of creative ways that stormwater retention is done, and it's also very attractive. And so that would give them an incentive to do those improvements. Another example is like the Walmart, the Albertsons store that's currently being renovated by Walmart. Well, they're just renovating the building itself, but because they're not tearing it down and building an entirely new building, they don't have to bring it up to current code. And so they don't have to do any stormwater retention. But with the fee coming, they would know that their fee is going to be high if they don't implement stormwater retention, so it would encourage them to do that. So I think the incentive part is really important. And lastly, I think the other reason it's important is because the nonprofits, churches, and so forth don't contribute at all. And they are contributing to the burden, and they're not contributing, they wouldn't be contributing under taxes. So those are three reasons I believe that it is important.
Herb Whittle on 19 Park Avenue, Vero Isles in the city. I think we need the stormwater retention utility because it is, as Judy said, the equitable way to get it done. And Daniel, you were talking about the fact that the city council can do it with ad valorem taxes. This past year, there was $100,000 in there, and this goes back to Vero Isles, and Chuck, you were saying, why is the city doing this? The city owns our streets. They own half of my front yard. And the drainage system in there is old, it's plugged, and it goes directly into the lagoon. That $100,000 was supposed to be put in there to take that drainage and put it into baffle boxes and then go in the lagoon. It was taken out because the city thought they were going to get a utility commission, or utility tax. So really, what we're talking about here is telling the city council, let's go ahead with this. It doesn't say we're going to probably even get it this year because it's going to take time to get this all done. We're not going to get it right away, even though we need it. And as I've told the city council before, maintenance is a hell of a lot cheaper than replacing things and getting when you have a failure. We had a failure of the water main on Sunday at the end of our street. It broke right in half. It's old. Everything in this town is getting old. And we're going to have money to replace it. And the other thing that bothers me is that we pay 3.2 mils tax to the county. We only pay 2.6 to the city. But we get much more out of the city. And the city has all these parks, etc., that the county uses, but they don't pay for. And we, as citizens, have to pay for it. Now, this is a much more equitable way to pay for getting our system back where it should be. And the city council hadn't had the guts to do it because everybody doesn't want to raise taxes. And we're only talking about, if we look at this, $5 on the average house per month, which isn't bad. But if you put it back to our tax base ad valorem, it's $10 a month on every taxpayer. So you're screwing the taxpayers by doing it. So I think we need to go ahead. We need to ask them to, you all need to pass a resolution saying, yes, let's the city council look at it. Let's go forward with this. Thank you.
Just a point of clarification. We're not, if this goes forward with a recommendation, it's a recommendation to continue the study. It's not a recommendation for a stormwater utility. There's a significant difference. And in terms of the specificity of the mechanics of putting together equivalent units and which of this kaleidoscope of different options, that is not in the purview as I see, except we've spent $51,000. Are we going to rip it up with the information we have, considering all of the issues, or at least have the option, since we haven't even gone to the community, we talked about a referendum, to ask what the community and the taxpayers want. So at this point, I can only speak for myself that I like to go forward. But
Mr. Chairman, that's what the purpose of this hearing was, I thought. To get information out to the public and ask for the public input on it.
Then at that point,
I've only heard two from the public.
Well,
see, I'm gonna sort of agree with Dan on that. When I read the agenda, I didn't see anything that said we were going to do one darn thing but listen. That's what it said. I didn't see anything that was suggested we were going to approve this. I think indirectly, when we approve this, we sort of say we're for adding $1 million to the taxpayers' cost.
Well, I disagree respectfully. I'm not doing that at all. I'm saying
I think
continue
you
the
are,
study.
because look, the city council did the first $50,000 without us. Now, why do they need us now?
Well, because for the public,
because they don't want to do it themselves.
Because the public, to be informed, has to have more complete information than a preliminary report, in my view. So to make a fully informed decision by the public, you'll have to have more specificity and more with the input. I'm sure there was some input today in terms of the questions in regard to going to the public with a full portfolio and not just a few introductory notes. That's my view.
Has anybody established how much more money is going to be needed to complete the study?
What?
Has anyone established how much more?
They said 120 total.
Another 50,000, I think you said.
They spent 50,000, but how much more is needed in order to come to
about another 50?
We're about halfway there.
Yeah.
This was to get us to the decision-making point, the jump-off point. If we go forward, we'll expend the rest of the contract, and I believe 103 was the total number. We've spent 51 to here.
Another 50,000. Right?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Can I get a clarification as far as you're saying $1 million in taxes? I keep hearing that number, $1 million, but I'm looking at, I did the numbers here. It's 485, isn't it? Extra over what we're already spending per year. It's not $1 million.
No, this is new money.
Yeah.
This is
that money that was currently in the budget previously was taken out, so it'll have to be put back in. So the $1 million is the total number.
All right, but the additional amount of money that we'd be spending from the point that we had before. I mean, you have 325 is current spending going to 500,000, 190 is current spending going to 500,000, and then 700,000 stays at 700,000. Right.
That was historically that had been spent in the past 5 years.
Right.
No money was put in the budget this year for any of that spending, so it would have to be reallocated.
Okay. All right, but I mean, presumably we have to spend a certain base amount of money. So when you're talking about, you're saying $1 million, I mean, that seems a little bit unfair.
No, we don't have, in the budget last year, we didn't have enough money to put the 450 in the budget. We took it out.
Okay.
So we're flat zero going forward. So we really are talking about $1 million a year here. Correct, Monty?
That's correct.
Yeah.
We're spending zero, which is obviously
because our budget is so tight. We didn't have enough money in the general fund budget to go forward on $500,000. Even after we passed the $1 million tax increases yet last year, we didn't have $500,000 to put in the capital structure. So we're dead zero in the capital structure general fund right at the moment.
For stormwater.
Roughly 50,000, but it's peanut. For all intents and purposes, it's gone.
For stormwater, yes, sir.
So if this isn't passed, then we're going to spend zero forever going forward?
Unless we find money in the operating budget going forward, then there is no money going forward in the operating budgets for capital expenditure, unless we find it in this year's operating statement.
If we spend money on stormwater, it would have to be reallocated from other committed sources. Yes, sir.
Yeah. So there's, yeah.
So you don't pave streets, instead you do stormwater as one of the trade-offs.
The biggest mistake I've ever seen in industry is cutting maintenance in order to save money and do capital projects. Cutting maintenance comes back and bites you really, really hard where you don't want to be bit. I think that's very foolish
Victor,
savings.
I'm in total agreement with that. I am in total agreement with that. All I'm saying is our taxpayers just went through $1 million tax increase. And now we're talking about another one. Now, I think before we do that, we should relook at our budgets and see if there's any way we can screw them down a little tighter so that our taxpayers and our ratepayers are not facing $1 million. Maybe, if we're lucky this year, that we can look forward to having a couple of solid years, we can generate $300,000 a year. I don't know that.
But it seems to me that that's an exercise that should be ongoing year by year, not just because we have a project. I think we should be looking at the budgets very carefully every year and see where we're spending money wisely and where we're not, and make the adjustments accordingly. But, you know, this is something which is affecting or could affect not just the Indian River Lagoon, but the viability of the city. You know, if we don't contribute to improving the lagoon and it keeps going, it keeps deteriorating, there's no reason for people to come and live in Vero Beach.
Victor, I couldn't agree more.
If you can't swim in the river, lagoon and you can't eat the fish.
I couldn't agree.
I already don't eat the fish out of the lagoon.
As a member of the Utility Commission, my take on this is that one of the frustrations in America is the crumbling infrastructure. I look at the very fact that we have pipes, structures, et cetera, that are in need. That's, I think, a fact, period. As I understand that a motion could be made today to move this forward, but it would make no financial commitment. And my question would be, would it come back to a joint committee again before that would take place? And would that also be a referendum issue to the citizens of the city of Vero Beach?
Jim?
I don't think so. I don't think they need a referendum.
Yes, every step of the way would come back to a joint meeting or an independent meeting of each board, but we would go through the Finance and Utility Commission as we progress through this if we continue to move forward and as we hit those steps along the way. So it would come back to you for...
And I think the frustration that people feel is the money being wisely spent. Obviously, when we have infrastructure that old, there needs to be a step-up process somewhere, sometime, in some way. And I think that I haven't heard enough information one way or the other, although I am a proponent of not increasing taxes. I just would like us to wisely spend what we have. I understand that there's, from the Finance Committee side, the cry to relook at budgets, which I think was a strong recommendation that needs to be done. But at the same time, from my viewpoint, if we have crumbling infrastructure, we need to move this forward in some fashion to get to that point of a recommendation to fix what we have out there.
The other thing, and it's important to note that our budget goes through the Finance Commission for review as well and comments back to the City Council. So we do that on an annual basis and try to keep the budget. Another question you had, Chuck, was does this have to go to referendum? It's not required by law, but I think the City Council up to this point has said it would be a referendum issue.
Mr. Chairman?
Thank you.
I agree with moving forward. And a couple of bases. One, these capital costs are not going to go away. In fact, with increasing regulations, they're probably going to increase. And I think this probably is the best time to move forward with that. We've got a crumbling infrastructure and more regulations in terms of keeping the lagoon clean. What I would recommend to for the study is that you do need somehow to simplify these reports. I could get a summary of this report after reading it carefully and digging out the details. I should have had that summary at the beginning. A clear 1 or 2 page summary of what this is about and what happened. Then you can go back and get the details. So I would make that recommendation when we go forward to add that to the report.
I think our consultants have taken note of that.
Yeah, an executive summary and a table of acronyms, please.
Right. Yeah. we will try to do that. Now, the little anxiety I have on executive summaries and, that type of thing is that we leave that one thing out and somebody jumps up in the back of the room and says, wait a minute, you hid this from us. Yeah. And so we try to be very clear that an executive summary, you still need to read the backup and the information provided because it's one of those things. And in Vero Beach, we have unlimited number of people who read the entire study. So.
And also some of the information we received only this morning, so it would be helpful to have it in advance, this presentation.
Yeah, the presentation was really geared off of the study itself.
Mm-hmm. I would personally would not be comfortable voting on any kind of rate methodology today. I think several of the firms said that this is just a first pass. I think the word fast was mentioned and quick and that kind of language. I think, to me, raises caution in proceeding in terms of making a recommendation on that. I think it should be just left to proceed, whether we proceed with the study or not, and keep it very simple. If we even decide to make a motion on that, it should be limited to that, in my opinion. So my understanding is that you're halfway through, and to proceed with the second half would be approximately, was it $50,000?
Approximately $50,000, a little over that. But it's going to be important that we're going to have to run the analysis on both of those options that we're looking at. So there may be some additional cost to that, which is not a problem. Mm-hmm. We'll live with whatever recommendation you make and ultimately what the City Council's decision is.
Yeah, because we've talked about, what's there? And frankly, I've had pastors of churches come to me complaining about, utilities, but the electric. So, passing on to them, some of these other charges, I would want to speak with them and get, input from the community before you make a recommendation in that regard. Because they're real people and they're really paying the bills. So.
And again, that's why we try to have these public meetings and discussions, and there's part of the outreach in order to explain what we are doing.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
Let me add one thing, and Chuck, thanks for bringing it up. The infrastructure issue is the issue that we have, and Public Works is in charge of that infrastructure that serves our community. But what people don't think of is if you have a water failure, your water doesn't work. If you have a power outage, your power doesn't work. If you have a failure in a stormwater pipe, it's really not a major personal inconvenience to anybody. A road pipe collapses in a road, hopefully we find it before somebody has an accident. We barricade the road till we get it fixed. Since we adopted the budget in October, we've had numerous failures that we are trying to find a way to fix somewhere around $200,000 worth that we're going to have to, through a budget amendment, reallocate some funds to make those. So the point I want to make is that the need for the infrastructure is there. And staff, like Mr. O'Connor said, is not advocating for how to fund that, just to show you that there is a need for that. And Public Works has cut their staff by 35% since 2009, so we're trying to do more with less, and we seem to be keeping our head above water with that. But the need for those improvements is out there. We're just trying to find a way to address it.
I think one of the biggest concerns was that there would be a need for extra employees. So if I understood it correctly, it was stated here today that there would not be a need for additional employees with regard to a stormwater utility. Is that correct?
That is correct. What you'll see is we have been doing a lot of the work in-house. We'll continue to do some of that, but if we go from spending $500,000 a year to $1 million, there's going to be a substantial amount of that has to be contracted out to accomplish that task. We're not going to gear up staff to do that.
Thank you.
I thank you for your patience for our comments. Please.
Do I have the floor?
Yes.
My name is Carter Taylor. I'm on the executive committee of the Indian River Neighborhood Association, and I'm also on the executive committee of the South Beach Property Owners Association. I live in South Beach, so would not be one of your customers for your stormwater utility. But a suggestion was made by a member of this joint committee that the general public, only 2 people from the general public have come up here and spoken. And I would like to just state affirmatively that both the organizations I represent, and the IRNA is the largest organization of its type in the county, are very much for this and would like to see this move forward. We think it's a good deal. We think that this is a fair and equitable way that removes from the general tax liability and creates an enterprise-like funding mechanism. Because of that, it's a more fair and more equitable way to provide long-term financial resources for these needed projects. We've also heard that there has been a systematic underinvestment in infrastructure, and infrastructure is the basis of our property values. We have in our county some, $19 billion worth of real estate, and the seed money to continue this study to provide a mechanism for financing infrastructure is a mere rounding error in terms of stakeholder value, if you will. One final comment is that I would warn this group not to conflate a tax increase with the structure upon which taxes or fees are raised in order to pay for infrastructure. It would be possible, depending on the rate that's eventually set, that this could be revenue neutral, and therefore the structure that's being proposed is really a separate question from what the rate ultimately will be, and that is driven by what need is deemed to be. Even if this were done in a revenue neutral way, it cannot be said to be a tax or fee increase, but it would still be a superior method upon which these revenues could be raised. And finally, I would like to say that by removing it from the general tax roll, it's a reduction of tax with, I understand, a sunset clause has been discussed, which taxpayers don't get that in their normal tax bills. Thank you.
I'm not sure quite I understand your. Would you explain how it's revenue neutral? I mean, what are you suggesting?
What I said was it could be revenue neutral and exists within this structure.
How could it be revenue neutral when we need about $1 million more in expenditures? I mean, what are you suggesting?
What I'm suggesting is that if you find that you have a need for less than $1 million, that it could be done in a way that's revenue neutral.
Well, that's true. I guess we find that we don't need to spend the money, that it's revenue neutral. But.
Stated another way, the reason that it's not revenue neutral is additional need has been found because of this crumbling infrastructure. That additional need has nothing to do with the manner in which the funds are raised. The manner in which the funds are raised presently is ad valorem taxes. That is to say, a narrower group of ratepayers, people are not paying based on how much they use the system. An enterprise fund is generally considered to be especially by conservative people, to be a more economically efficient way of raising the money. The decision of how much money that is ultimately needed is a completely separate decision from how it's to be raised.
Don't disagree with that. Agree.
You're asking the ratepayers to pay $5 a month, basically.
No, I haven't established a rate.
That's what the study is recommending.
The study's using that as a notional figure based on figures that Public Works provided for the project that they'd like to do.
Recommendation as to what?
No, that's beyond the scope of this present decision. The present decision is whether or not you want to evaluate this as a framework for raising capital funds. And the organizations I represent think this is a very good idea, and they should proceed with it.
Thank you for your comments, Carter.
Thank you.
Mr. Mitchell.
Excuse me.
Excuse me.
The study has shown us the $5 a month, but if there's 8,800 residents in Vero Beach, and mostly residents are two-person families?
No, there's, were you referring to what I had said?
Yeah, are there 8,800 residents in Vero Beach?
There's 8,800 customers who are not in the city of Vero Beach. There are 22,000 total customers, commercial and business, in the water, sewer,
so there's
utility.
How many in Vero Beach? 14,000 then?
Yeah.
So 14,000 people, 7,000 would be paying.
It's 14,000 customers.
I guess all I'm asking is, what is the real number? What is the real $5 number?
He said it right, though. If you think about it this way, 14,000 times 60, right? And that's basically what we're coming in at. That's $840,000 a year. The remainder, roughly about 250,000, comes in through our commercial side and some of the institutions. The city's part of that $1 million raise, spread over its entities, is about $160,000 a year, spread over the whole. The remainder of that comes in from the commercial. We have very little commercial, but when you look at, if you looked at his page, I think it's page 11, okay, and look at column 1B, right? No, not the one. Yeah, the other one he sent out. If you look at that, and that's what this group is advocating. 1B on page 11. So you can see where the city has got roughly 2,700 ERUs. And just quickly multiplying that by $60, right? There's your $160,000 to the city. Just rough. Now, these are rough numbers. It's going to be refined. Then you can see on a commercial side, if you take the 44 and add the 1,400 for the institutions, we got another 6,000. 6,000 times the $60. There's 360,000 theoretically allocated to our commercial institutional customers.
Right.
Theoretically.
Okay, well, if we're comfortable with the numbers,
yeah,
and I'll take your word for it, I'm in Judy's camp 100%. I really think we should move forward with the stormwater situation. I think the thousands of plant life and the thousands of live life in Lagoon is suffering every single day, and the longer we wait, the worse it'll get. I don't understand why we just can't send this back or put a motion on the table to spend the additional $50,000 and encourage the Finance Committee and the City Council to find as much money from the gas savings and the like that they can find so that we can reduce the overall initial tax on our residents. And to me, that covers what we should be doing today.
Thank you. I certainly was going to offer motions from the both, but I wanted all of the complete and input from everyone who wants to have their say, both in the public, the staff, the consultants, and of course ourselves. So I know it's tedious at times, but the bottom line is I wanted to be as open and as candid and welcoming to all the comments before we have a motion.
Mark Mucher again. I realized that I jumped around a lot. I might not have been clear as to how I felt about this. I strongly feel that we should perform all these functions. The question, and maybe some of you disagree with that, but that doesn't necessarily equate to establishing a stormwater authority. It's just the question really is, if you're going to perform all these functions, how are you going to pay for it? Now, let's say you all decide to form a stormwater authority and then it goes to referendum some November or some special election. The problem with that is if it doesn't pass and you know, people a lot of times vote with their wallets, it may not. So you need a plan B. And, you know, if you're going to plan for a plan B, then, you know, plan B might overtake the plan A. And that's why I asked you originally to, you know, consider just doing this in a more conventional ad valorem fashion.
Well, my point is that, just to clarify, at least the motion I would support is to go forward with a study to have the material to be able to present to the public with fuller knowledge, not to support a rate or even support, per se, a storm water utility. I just support a study to its completion so we have more complete information. That's all. Mr. Vice.
Do I have the floor?
Mr. Winger?
Yes. Bill Tesson will remember this because we dealt with this 6 years ago, I think, in the Finance Commission. I think one thing I hear, no one's necessarily saying raising any taxes $1 million or not raising $1 million. This is a procedure to fix infrastructure. That's what it really is. You know, I referred to Bill because he and we were on the Finance Commission. He was chair and I was vice chair 6 years ago. And I've wrestled now with 6 budgets on this city. And of course, was part of the group that wrestled with last budget. We were faced with more expenses than we could fund. What happened was we needed, Monty, I'm not sure the numbers, $600,000 or $700,000 for roads, and we cut it way back. We wanted to put $500,000 into the stormwater, and we eliminated it. And beyond that, it was, what was it, Cindy? 400 and some odd thousand on the OPED.
That wasn't in the budget.
No.
Substantial quantity of money on the recreation.
Yeah, but so what happens every year is infrastructure gets kicked down the road. And so what you're really talking about here is a mechanism where whoever is elected to city council doesn't have the right to kick down the road what happens to the infrastructure, in this particular case, to get rid of stormwater. That's what you're really talking about. And, you know, nothing says when we do this year's budget that the current rate of 238, which started out being 268, which was 204 before that, will be that. I mean, that becomes a separate argument of how this is funded. I mean, nothing says that the rate has to stay 238, it can't go down commensurate with this. What this really does is it says it takes out of the hands of 5 elected people the decision to kick the can down the road and say we're not going to fix infrastructure. In my opinion, that's really what the real decision is here. And I would like to see a mechanism whereby we're sure that this problem is going to get fixed, not for ourselves, but for our children and our grandchildren in the years ahead. And I think we're confusing it. It's a mechanism. It's not necessarily a tax increase. And I hope you'll all come for our budget sessions this year and help us with that, because the reality is we're going to have a tough time this year too. And this needs to go into the pot, and it would be perfectly fair, Glenn, or whoever wants to say it, to say, okay, if this moves forward, that should go into the equation for the ad valorem tax, and maybe it should be less. I don't know. But this is a mechanism, and I think we need the mechanism so that whoever is elected to city council has to face the infrastructure. Thanks for the comment.
Mr. Chairman, I'll make one more comment and then I'll quit. But in my opinion, the pluses of this situation, the real plus, is the dedicated funds. And if we go forward, and if the city goes forward, I think the plus of it is that we do have dedicated funds. We can't misuse those funds. We need them for the capital structure, and I think that's the very positive part of the deal. And I do think we need the capital investment. And we've got $25 million in infrastructure sitting out that we all know it's old, and we're only going to spend $1 million a year. That's not a lot. Even $500,000 is not a lot. That's peanuts about probably what we really need. So I'm not opposed to this program. I'm just opposed to how we're handling it a little bit. So I'll make a motion that we go forward and approve the city another $50,000 for the study.
I'll second that one. Nothing to do with the...
I'm not proving anything else.
No, that's the point. We're just talking about going forward to complete the study. Any comment from the other members of the Finance Commission?
This is a recommendation to council that they go forward, right?
Yes.
Is this a joint recommendation?
No, this is only for the Finance Commission at this point. So, Finance Commission members, any comment? Or
I agree with it. Yeah.
Well, it's been seconded. Want to call the roll then?
Sure. Mr. Stump?
No.
Mr. Smith?
Yes.
Mr. Polakwik?
Yes.
Mr. Revant?
Yes.
Mr. Gorey?
Yes.
It passes 4-1.
With that, in my role, I'll then ask, are there any comments or a motion from the utility commissioners?
I'd like to make the motion that we go forward and spend the extra money to finish the study.
Comment?
Well, I would like to ask that it be stated within the motion that we are also recommending that the study will come back to us. I know it's been stated that it will, but that the study will return to the joint commissions, and with the recommendation that there will be a public referendum on this, since evidently it is not a matter of law, and I thought that it was.
Judy, I don't think you have a second. I'll second for discussion. Question, do we have quorum? Can we proceed with the vote?
Yes, you do have a quorum.
Okay.
Were you making that as an amendment to my motion?
Yes. I didn't understand what you just said. It seems to me like you altered the motion.
Laura asked for there to be a mandated referendum, and I will not accept that amendment to my motion.
Let's just vote. I would like just to vote on Judy's motion.
And it was the second.
You're on the finance, aren't you?
I'm on utilities.
Oh.
You ready?
Could I ask why the issue of the referendum's a concern?
I just don't want to make that decision at this point that it has to be a referendum. The decision to me that we're making right now is just to move forward with the study and to spend the additional dollars to move forward with the study.
I mentioned it because the staff said that it was not a matter of law, and that it was just that the city council to this point had agreed to a public referendum, and I think that's important. I think it's very, very important that the public be the final ones to make this decision. They pay the bill. I think that's very important.
I'd like to go back to. I don't think it's within the purview of the Utilities Commission.
No, we're making a suggestion. All of these are. Remember, we're an advisory board, and on everything we do is a suggestion or a recommendation. We're not dictating anything to anyone.
I can only speak for the Finance Commission, but the point is this is going to be recycled any number of times, and and this is how the process works with the City Council and with the city staff. So at this point, the reason that I firmly supported, and we did 4-1 on the Finance Commission, is the one simple rifle shot issue: go or no go with the study. But any more input from there's a motion on the floor from the utility.
I agree with the motion to keep it straightforward, that we go or no go, and that we make a motion. I think Judy made the motion that we allow them to complete the study, and that all that means is they're allowed to spend on the remainder of the money to complete the study, to come back forward with a completed study that we will again review, I'm sure, in depth.
Call the motion.
Mr. Baczynski?
Yes.
Mrs. Moss?
Yes.
Mr. McDermott?
Yes.
Mr. Teston?
Yes.
Mr. LaPointe?
Yes.
Ms. Zorcut?
Yes.
Mr. Meckling?
Yes.
It passes 7-0.
With that,
Mr. Chairman, before you all adjourn, because a lot has been said about spending $50,000. In working with our consultants on this, we may need more transparency than what was budgeted in the project, because I envision there probably will be many more meetings than we anticipated going into this exercise. So if you don't limit me to that budget, because we may have to make amendments as we go forward, because we want to make sure that it's transparent and the discussion involves everyone in this room. So the movement forward, and I'm taking the motion, we're moving forward with the stormwater study. That'll be the recommendation to the City Council and then the City Council. But if we feel administratively we need to have more meetings to discuss with the Utilities and Finance Commission as well as the City Council, we may have a contract amendment.
I don't want to encumber a simple yes, no, go forward. We'll do that the next time around, and I'm sure we will have these marathon meetings in the future together. Well, thank you very much, everyone.
Something I can read.
Oh, man.